Episode 1, The Body Remembers. Somewhere in this city, right now, someone's body just made a decision their mind hasn't caught up to yet. A door slams. A shoulder drops. A jaw locks. They don't know why. They just know they're not safe, even though this time, they are. This is the body keeping score. 7 out of 10 of us will live through a potentially traumatic event. That's not a rare wound. That's most of the room you're standing in. And for some of those people, not all, but some, that moment doesn't end when the door stops slamming. It moves in. It rearranges the furniture. It starts answering the phone. You cannot see it on any of these faces. That's the first thing to understand. Trauma doesn't announce itself. It doesn't limp. It doesn't wear a sign. It sits behind ordinary eyes, in an ordinary body, doing an extraordinary amount of invisible work just to get through a Tuesday. This is a series about what happens after the worst moment of someone's life, not the moment itself, but everything that comes after. The years. The decades, sometimes. The quiet, private war between a person and their own nervous system. And it's about something else, too, something almost nobody tells you when you're in it. That the body's memory isn't a life sentence. It's a language. And once you learn to read it, you can start to answer back. Here's the question this episode is built around, and it's a bigger question than it sounds. If a threat is over, why does the body sometimes refuse to believe it? Ask someone who's lived through combat what happens when a car backfires 2 blocks away. They'll tell you it isn't a thought. There's no internal debate. No, that's probably nothing. Their heart is already pounding before the sound finishes traveling to their ear. That reaction has a name and a location. It lives in a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons, called the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. In people carrying trauma, research using brain imaging has consistently found this region running hot, hyperreactive, quick to fire, slow to stand down. And the region that's supposed to talk it down, the prefrontal cortex, the part of you that reasons and that says, this is a car, not a war zone, often goes quiet exactly when it's needed most. It's not a weakness. It's architecture. A nervous system that learned, once, under real threat, to skip the thinking and go straight to reacting because that split second saved a life. The problem is, it never got the memo that the war ended. That's the question we're going to spend this episode chasing. What does it actually mean? Biologically, for a body to remember what a mind would rather forget, is that memory something a person is stuck with or something they can rewrite? Part 1, a diagnosis that had to be fought for. Before we go further into the science, it's worth pausing on something easy to forget. For most of recorded history, this thing we're describing had no name at all. Soldiers coming home from war have described these symptoms for as long as war has existed. Records survive from ancient Mesopotamia, more than 3,000 years old, describing haunted, sleepless men who had seen combat and could not leave it behind. In the First World War, it was called shell shock, a theory, at first, that something in the concussion of exploding artillery had physically bruised the brain. That theory didn't survive contact with the evidence. Soldiers who had never been near an explosion showed the same symptoms. Even before shell shock had a name, a handful of clinicians were circling the same idea from different directions. In late 19th century France, the psychiatrist Pierre Janet was already describing traumatized patients whose bodies acted out memories their conscious minds could not retrieve, what he called automatisms. Around the same time, Sigmund Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer were treating patients with what was then called hysteria and noticing something similar. Symptoms with no physical cause, appearing to trace back to overwhelming experiences the patient could not consciously narrate. Freud would later abandon much of this early thinking. And historians still argue about why. But the core observation that an experience too overwhelming to process consciously might still shape a person's body and behavior has proven remarkably durable. It's the same observation, dressed in different scientific language, as this. The entire episode keeps circling back. By the Second World War, the condition was renamed again battle fatigue, a combat stress reaction. And then, astonishingly, in 1968, the diagnosis vanished. The second edition of the official psychiatric manual dropped it entirely. Men came home from a war, and there was, officially, no name for what was happening to them. It took the sustained advocacy of Vietnam veterans themselves organizing, testifying, and refusing to be told their suffering wasn't real alongside a small number of psychiatrists willing to listen, to get it back into the manual. In 1980, post-traumatic stress disorder finally became an official diagnosis. And crucially, it was defined for the first time as something that could happen to anyone, not just soldiers. Survivors of assault. Survivors of disaster. Survivors of childhood abuse. The same wound, regardless of the uniform, or lack of one, the person had been wearing when it happened. We're telling you this history for a reason. Every idea in this series, the neuroscience, the treatments, even the controversies we're about to walk into honestly exists because people were suffering and refused to accept that their suffering had no name. That fight isn't ancient history. It's the ground this entire field still stands on. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with what it must have felt like to live through that gap, to come home from a jungle on the other side of the world with a body that would not stop bracing for an ambush, and to be told, officially, in writing, that there was no such condition. Imagine describing a wound no map would draw. That is the position an entire generation of veterans occupied for over a decade. Their bodies kept the score long before the profession had a scoreboard to write it on. Part 2, the body's own vocabulary. Long before any of this had a clinical name, the body was already speaking in its own vocabulary, and it's worth learning to read that vocabulary before we go further, because it recurs in every single episode of this series. Hyperarousal is the loudest word in that vocabulary. It's the racing heart, the jumped nerve, and the sleep that won't come because some part of the nervous system refuses to stand down its watch even in a locked, quiet room. People living with it describe lying in bed at 3 in the morning, exhausted and wide awake at the same time, a state the body was never designed to hold for years on end, only for the handful of minutes it takes to outrun or outfight a genuine threat. But there's a second word in that vocabulary, spoken much more quietly and far less discussed. Hypoarousal. Not the racing heart, but its opposite, a kind of flatness, a fog, a sense of watching your own life from behind glass. Where hyperarousal is the accelerator jammed to the floor. Hypoarousal is the emergency brake, engaged so hard the whole system stalls. Clinicians sometimes call the most extreme version of this dissociation a temporary, protective disconnection from feeling, from memory, and sometimes even from a felt sense of being inside your own body at all. Both states, the racing and the flatness, are the same nervous system trying to solve the same impossible problem: how do you survive something you can neither fight nor flee? For a great many trauma survivors, the answer their body found, in the moment it needed one most, was to go still. Freeze. And sometimes, that instruction never fully gets cancelled. We are naming both of these clearly and early because so much of the public conversation about trauma focuses only on the loud version, the flashback, the panic, the startle. The quiet version, the person who feels perpetually numb, foggy, and distant from their own life, is trauma too. It just doesn't look like what film and television have trained us to expect trauma to look like. Part 3, Inside the Architecture of Fear. Let's go inside the brain itself. 3 regions matter most in this story. The amygdala, the alarm. The hippocampus is the filing cabinet, the part of the brain that stamps a memory with time and place, that tells you this happened then, not now. And the prefrontal cortex, the part that's supposed to be in charge, weighing evidence and making judgment calls. Under chronic or severe stress, imaging studies have found something remarkable: the hippocampus can shrink. Not permanently disappear, shrink, its volume reduced, its filing system disrupted. And when the filing cabinet is compromised, memories don't file cleanly. They don't get stamped then. Some of them stay marked, now, indefinitely. That's one leading theory for why a smell, a sound, or a certain slant of afternoon light can drop someone back into a moment they lived through years, even decades, ago. Not remembering it. Reliving it. But here's what the research also insists we say clearly, because it matters: not everyone exposed to trauma develops this pattern. Far from it. Roughly 2 out of 3 people who live through trauma do not go on to develop diagnosable psychological injury. Some brains, some circumstances, seem to carry protective weight. Researchers have found, for instance, that larger amygdala and hippocampal volumes in some individuals appear associated with more resilient outcomes, not fewer. Biology isn't destiny here. It's more like terrain, it shapes the path, but it doesn't decide, alone, where anyone ends up. There's a second system worth understanding, because it explains a different piece of the puzzle: why trauma so often lives in the body as exhaustion, not just fear. It's called the HPA axis, a chemical relay running from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the adrenal glands, ending in the release of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. In the immediate aftermath of trauma, this system tends to flood the body with cortisol, a state researchers call hypercortisolemia. But here's the twist that surprised even the scientists studying it: in some people who go on to develop PTSD, that pattern reverses over time. The system, exhausted from sounding the alarm, starts producing less cortisol than a typical nervous system would, even under real stress. Researchers have started calling this the cortisol paradox of trauma, a nervous system that ran so hot for so long it eventually runs cold, misfiring in the opposite direction. It's one reason a person carrying old trauma can look, from the outside, flat, tired, and disengaged, when what's actually happening is a stress response system that spent itself out years ago and never fully recalibrated. Which raises an uncomfortable, important question: if it isn't simply about what happened to you, what is it about? The answer, it turns out, has as much to do with what happens after the event as the event itself. Support. Safety. Whether the story got finished. Part 4, how early, how common, how uneven. Now widen the lens, because the trauma this series is chasing doesn't only arrive as a single catastrophic event. Often, it arrives early, and it arrives repeatedly, in the ordinary architecture of a childhood. More than 60% of American adults report at least one adverse childhood experience: abuse, neglect, a household disrupted by addiction, violence, or loss. Among today's high schoolers, surveyed directly rather than through a parent's account, more than 3 in 4 report at least one, nearly 1 in 5 report 4 or more. These aren't fringe numbers. This is the ordinary. Whether a huge share of the population grew up in. And the research on what those early experiences do is not gentle reading. Adults who carried multiple adverse childhood experiences show measurably higher risks across almost every domain. Researchers have checked mental health, substance use, chronic disease, and even socioeconomic outcomes decades later. The body, it turns out, keeps a ledger that starts running long before most of us have any conscious memories at all. This is not a story about broken people. 60% of a population is not a broken population. It's a story about how ordinary, widespread early adversity is, and how much of adult life, for a great many people, is quietly shaped by a decade they can barely remember. The numbers are not evenly distributed, and it's worth sitting with why, and worth being specific, because vague statistics let all of us off the hook too easily. Trauma type matters enormously. Research tracking PTSD rates by the nature of the event has found that survivors of rape develop PTSD at dramatically higher rates than survivors of natural disaster by some estimates, roughly 1 in 2, compared with fewer than 1 in 25. That is not a small gap. It's one of the largest differences in this entire field, and it tells us something important. PTSD is not simply a function of danger or fear in the abstract. It has consistently been found to be worse and more likely when the harm was intentional, inflicted by another person rather than by weather or chance or geology. Military service tells a related story. Among veterans of the more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, lifetime PTSD prevalence has been estimated as high as 29%. Several times the rate in the general population. And the most recent nationally representative survey of U.S. veterans, conducted in 2025 and 2026, found lifetime PTSD prevalence had risen to roughly 14%, nearly double what earlier survey waves recorded across the 2010s. Researchers point to demographic shifts in the veteran population and evolving patterns of trauma exposure as likely explanations. This is a moving number, not a fixed one, and the direction it's currently moving is upward. In the United States overall, roughly 6% of adults will meet the clinical criteria for PTSD at some point in their lives. But that 6% hides real disparities. Women develop it at roughly twice the rate of men. Some of that gap is about exposure. The kinds of trauma more commonly experienced by women carry particularly high rates of resulting PTSD, as the rape statistic above illustrates. Some of it may be biological. All of it is still being understood in any documentary. Anyone who claims to have the full picture is lying to you. What we do know, with real confidence, is this: trauma is not rare, its imprint is not imaginary, and it is not evenly, randomly scattered across a population. It follows patterns of exposure, of intent, of support, of history. And that brings us to the heart of this episode and the reason this series exists at all: a single, contested, controversial idea that changed how an entire generation talks about pain. Part 5, The Idea and the Fight Over It. In 2014, a psychiatrist published a book that argued something radical: that trauma isn't just a story the mind tells. It's a pattern the body holds in muscle tension, in a racing heart, in a gut that clenches for no reason anyone can name. The idea was that the body keeps a score the conscious mind can't always read. Millions of people read it and felt, for the first time, truly understood. And here is where this documentary owes you something most don't bother to offer: honesty about the argument that followed. Because a significant number of researchers, serious ones, at serious institutions, pushed back hard. Harvard psychologist Richard McNally called the underlying theory's evidence base bad. Strained, describing an early version of it as a theory in search of a phenomenon. A 2025 critique in the journal Frontiers in Systems Neuroscience argued the body-centered framing understates something crucial: the active, interpretive role the mind plays in how trauma is processed. That healing isn't only a body story, it's a meaning-making one too. The criticism isn't that trauma leaves no mark on the body. The neuroscience on the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the HPA axis we just walked through is well replicated. The criticism is narrower and more useful than it first sounds: that some specific claims that trauma gets stored in tissue and organs, the way a bruise sits under skin, for instance, reach further than the current evidence supports. Take the question of chronic pain and autoimmune disease, since it's one of the most repeated claims connected to this idea. There is real, growing research linking trauma exposure to conditions like fibromyalgia, chronic regional pain syndrome, and certain rheumatic diseases. But the newest work in this space, antibody research published just this year, is finding that some of these conditions may have distinct autoimmune mechanisms of their own, biological processes running in parallel to trauma rather than directly caused by it. The honest scientific position, right now, in the summer of 2026, is a correlated, plausible mechanism, not yet proven direct causation. That's a less satisfying sentence than, your trauma became your illness. It also happens to be the true one. There's an even newer, stranger thread in this research, genuinely worth naming and genuinely worth treating with caution. Some scientists have found that trauma may leave chemical marks on specific genes, a process called epigenetic modification, that can, in some studied populations, appear to be passed to the next generation. Descendants of Holocaust survivors have been studied for exactly this pattern. This is real, published research. It is also early, contested, and far from a settled finding about how strongly, or how reliably, this happens in most families. We're telling you about it because it's fascinating and because it's part of the honest picture, not because the science is finished. Part 6, Why the Fight Matters. Why does any of this matter to you, watching this, maybe not particularly interested in an academic feud? Because how a culture explains suffering shapes how it treats it. If trauma lives only in stories, you talk it through. If it lives only in the body, you move it out. The truth, as usual, refuses to be that simple. The most careful researchers in this field, on both sides of the argument, actually converge on something: effective trauma treatment addresses the body and the meaning-making mind. Neither one alone tells the whole story. Consider a composite drawn from real clinical patterns. Call him Carlos, 34, a combat veteran who hadn't slept through a full night in 6 years. 10 sessions of EMDR, a therapy that uses guided eye movement to help the brain reprocess stuck memories, and he described it like this: he stopped reliving the battlefield every day. He started merely knowing it happened. That's not a cure. Nobody serious calls it one. But it's a measurable, real, repeatable shift. But here's the harder truth this series won't hide from you, because a documentary that only tells success stories isn't honest, it's marketing. Even the treatments researchers call gold standard don't work for everyone. Recent research reviewing military and veteran populations found that between 39 and 72% of people receiving frontline treatments cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and EMDR did not achieve meaningful symptom relief. Among civilians, non-response still hovers near 39%. And roughly 16% of adult patients, 36% of veterans, leave treatment before it's even finished. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything that comes next in this series. This isn't a story about a body that's broken and a handful of treatments that fix it. It's a story about a genuinely difficult medical and psychological problem, where even our best tools help a great many people and still leave real people behind, and where the search for better answers is very much still underway. Part 7. What the evidence actually supports. So what actually works? Not everything claims to work. What the evidence, carefully weighed, actually supports, and where the evidence still runs thin. EMDR carries strong research backing and is recommended as a first-line treatment by both the World Health Organization and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Trauma-sensitive yoga, developed in part out of the very research center associated with the body-centered theory, has its own growing evidence base. A 2026 meta-analysis found it significantly reduced PTSD symptoms across most symptom clusters, including intrusive memories. There's also somatic experiencing, a body-oriented approach distinct from yoga or EMDR, built around helping the nervous system complete physical stress responses that were interrupted at the moment of trauma. A randomized controlled trial testing it specifically on patients with chronic low back pain and PTSD found measurable improvement over standard treatment alone. That's a meaningful data point, because it's exactly the kind of body-mind overlap this whole controversy is arguing about, and here, at least, the body-first approach has a real trial behind it, not just a compelling story. And there's a nervous system framework, developed by researcher Stephen Porges, called polyvagal theory, which, like the body-centered trauma theory itself, has both passionate advocates and real scientific critics. Its central, less contested insight is simpler than the theory around it. Co-regulation, the calming presence of another safe nervous system, is one of the most powerful tools human beings have for settling their own. Consider a second composite, drawn from a real and growing model of integrated care, a woman in her late 20s, carrying the aftermath of childhood abuse, who had cycled through years of weekly talk therapy with only partial relief. In 2025, a small number of clinics began piloting an intensive combined model, weeks of trauma-sensitive yoga specifically sequenced to prepare the nervous system, followed immediately by concentrated EMDR sessions, rather than the standard once-a-week, 50-minute format most insurance systems default to. Early practitioners of the combined approach described something specific: patients who could not previously tolerate revisiting a memory in therapy, whose systems would flood or shut down entirely before any processing could happen, became able to stay present through it because the body had already been taught, through the yoga, what safety felt like from the inside. This is not yet large-scale, randomized evidence. It's a promising clinical pattern, worth watching, but not yet a proven protocol. We tell you that distinction every time, in this series, because it's the difference between hope and hype. Then there's the frontier treatments that are promising, genuinely exciting to researchers, and not yet proven enough to promise anyone results. Neurofeedback trains a person to directly influence their own brain activity in real time, watching a live readout of their own neural patterns and learning, gradually, to shift them. Some studies using this method on the amygdala specifically have reported meaningful symptom improvement in roughly 2/3 of participants in early trials. It sounds remarkable, and it might be. But the current clinical guidelines from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense are explicit: there is still insufficient evidence to formally recommend neurofeedback for PTSD, either for or against. The FDA has cleared one version of the technology for use alongside, not instead of, established treatments. That's exactly where honest science sits, with a promising new idea, hopeful, cautious, and not yet finished checking its own homework. None of these treatments is magic. None of them works identically for every person, every type of trauma, or every nervous system. What the honest through line looks like, across every therapy we've just named, is this: healing tends to involve both processing the story consciously and letting the body complete something it never got to finish. Mind alone struggles. The body alone struggles. Together, something shifts for many people, not yet for everyone, and the research is chasing that gap, which is some of the most important work happening in psychiatry today. Part 8, Two Roads from the Same Fire. There's one more piece of honest research worth sitting with before we close, because it complicates the picture in the best possible way. Trauma not only produces damage. A real, if still developing, body of research has documented something called post-traumatic growth, measurable positive psychological change that some people experience specifically because of, not despite, having lived through something devastating. In longitudinal studies following people through genuinely difficult collective events, researchers have found roughly 1 in 5 reporting moderate to high levels of this kind of growth, a deepened sense of meaning, closer relationships, and a recalibrated sense of what matters. It correlates most strongly with resilience, with social support, and with staying engaged rather than withdrawing. We want to be careful here, because this is a place where trauma narratives can tip into something dishonest, the idea that suffering is secretly a gift, that everyone who endures enough hardship will eventually find themselves grateful for it. That is not what this research says, and this series will never say it either. Most people who live through trauma do not describe their suffering as worth it. Growth, where it happens alongside pain, not instead of it, and it is never guaranteed, never owed to anyone, and never a fair trade for what was taken. But it does tell us something real about the range of what's possible on the other side of an experience like this. The same event can leave one person with a nervous system stuck permanently bracing for the next disaster, and can leave another, sometimes even the very same person, years apart, with a hard-won clarity about what actually matters in the time they have left. Both are true responses to trauma. Neither cancels the other out. Part 9, What the Body Reaches For. There's a question we haven't asked yet, and it's one of the most important in this entire episode. What does a person actually do, day to day, while carrying a nervous system stuck in this state? Nobody survives years of unrelenting hyperarousal or years of numbing hypoarousal without finding some way to cope. And not every coping strategy a person finds is one they'd choose if they were choosing freely. PTSD is associated with a 2 to 3-fold higher risk of co-occurring depression and substance use disorder. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a moral failing. Alcohol slows a racing nervous system down. Certain drugs quiet an amygdala that won't stop firing. For a person with no other tools, no access to treatment, and no language yet for what's happening in their body, self-medication is often the first strategy that actually seems to work, right up until it doesn't, until it becomes its own separate crisis stacked on top of the first one. This matters for how we watch every case study in this series. A person struggling with addiction alongside trauma is not two separate problems wearing one face. Very often, it is one nervous system doing its best with the only tools it could find at the only moment it had to find them. Effective treatment increasingly recognizes this, addressing substance use and trauma together. Rather than requiring someone to achieve sobriety before anyone will address the wound underneath it, or requiring trauma resolution before anyone will address the addiction on top of it. The old model asked a person to solve one crisis using a nervous system already overwhelmed by the other. The newer model treats them as intertwined, because biologically, that's exactly what they are. We raise this not to excuse harm caused by substance use and not to romanticize it. We raise it because judgment is cheap and understanding is what actually helps, and because this series is going to introduce you, across its 8 episodes, to real patterns of human coping that only make sense once you understand the nervous system underneath them. Part 10, The Night Shift. There's one more room in this house we haven't opened yet, and it's the room where a great deal of the real repair work either happens or fails to happen: sleep. Trauma and sleep are locked in a particularly cruel loop. Research tracking survivors in the months after a traumatic event has found that sleep disturbance, insomnia, fragmented sleep, and nightmares doesn't just follow trauma. It often predicts which people go on to develop full PTSD and which don't, suggesting the relationship runs in both directions at once. Here's why that matters biologically. REM sleep, the stage where most vivid dreaming happens, appears to play a specific, active role in emotional healing. During healthy REM sleep, activity in the amygdala and related fear circuits is normally suppressed, allowing the brain to revisit emotional memories in a kind of low-stakes rehearsal and file them away with their emotional charge reduced. Researchers call this process, when it works, emotional recalibration. In trauma, that process frequently breaks down. Nightmares interrupt REM sleep before it can finish its work. Researchers increasingly describe trauma nightmares not as random bad dreams, but as failed attempts at emotional processing. The brain is trying to revisit the material and gets overwhelmed partway through, jolting the sleeper awake before the memory can be safely refiled. The person wakes exhausted, the memory undigested, and the next night, the brain tries again, often with the same result. Sleep, which should be the nervous system's nightly repair shift, becomes something to dread instead. This is precisely why sleep-focused treatments techniques like imagery rehearsal therapy, which trains a person to consciously rewrite a recurring nightmare's ending while awake, or medications specifically aimed at reducing nightmare frequency have become a serious, evidence-informed part of trauma treatment, not an afterthought to it. You cannot fully process a wound during the day if the one biological system built to help you process it every night keeps getting interrupted before it can finish the job. And this is where the science turns, quietly, toward hope. The same neuroplasticity that allowed a threat to rewire a nervous system in the first place is the mechanism by which that nervous system can be rewired again, toward safety. Neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to form new connections and reorganize existing ones, doesn't switch off after childhood, and it doesn't switch off after trauma. It's most active, in fact, during exactly the states we've spent this episode describing as sites of injury, deep, restorative sleep, and the safe, repeated, embodied experiences at the center of therapies like EMDR, yoga, and somatic experiencing. The system that learned fear through repetition is, mechanically, the same system that can learn safety through repetition. That is not wishful thinking. It's the same biological principle, running in the other direction. Part 11, the alarm can be retrained. Go back to that flinch. That hand that tenses before the mind even knows why. It's not proof of damage. It's proof of a nervous system that learned, once, to survive something unsurvivable and learned it so well the lesson outlasted the danger. That's not a life sentence. The same architecture that can learn fear can learn safety. Slower and with more work than any book jacket will admit, but it can. The hippocampus that shrinks under chronic stress has also been observed, in some studies, to begin to recover volume after successful treatment. The nervous system that flinches at a slammed door is the same nervous system that, given enough safety, enough repetition, and enough time, can learn to let the door just be a door again. Think about what that actually means, practically, for the person standing in that kitchen at the start of this episode. It means the flinch is not who they are. It's a message from a much younger version of their nervous system, still standing guard over a threat that ended a long time ago. And messages, unlike identities, can be answered. Return, for a moment, to Carlos the composite we introduced earlier, 34 years old and 6 years without a full night's sleep. Picture the actual shape of that life before treatment, the car he wouldn't drive anymore because an overpass reminded him of a checkpoint. The 4th of July, he spent in a closet, because fireworks and gunfire share the same signature with a nervous system that has stopped distinguishing between them. The relationships that quietly ended, one at a time, because a person who is always scanning the room for the exit has very little left over to give to the people already inside it. None of that was a character flaw. Every part of it was a nervous system doing exactly what it had been trained, under fire, to do. The tragedy of trauma is rarely that the body malfunctions. It's that the body performs its one job: keep you alive with such relentless competence that it forgets to stop once the danger has actually passed. And picture the other side of that 10-week course of treatment, not a man transformed into someone who never thinks about what happened, because that man does not exist and this series will never promise you he does. Picture, instead, a man who can drive under an overpass again. Who can sit through a fireworks show, tense, maybe, but present, in his body, in the moment, with the people beside him, rather than back in a memory 11 years and half a world away. That is not everything. For the person living it, it is very nearly everything. This is where the phrase that gives this whole series its shape starts to mean something different from what it did an hour ago. Emotional control, the thing so many people spend years white-knuckling their way through, gritting their teeth, forcing calm they don't feel, isn't the same thing as mastery. Control is a nervous system fighting itself, spending enormous energy holding a lid on a pot that never stops boiling underneath. Mastery is something else entirely, a nervous system that has learned, through real evidence, repeated and earned, that it is finally safe enough to stand down on its own. Not because it was told to. Because it was shown over and over until it was believed. That's not a metaphor. It's measurable, in cortisol curves that begin to normalize, in amygdala reactivity that begins to settle, in a hippocampus slowly refiling memories where they actually belong in the past. Every therapy this episode has named, from EMDR to trauma-sensitive yoga to somatic experiencing to the still unproven promise of neurofeedback, is, underneath its particular method, doing the same essential work, teaching a nervous system, through direct, repeated, felt experience, that the war it's still fighting ended. If you are watching this and recognizing your own body in it, the flinch, the fog, the sleep that won't come, the numbness where feeling should be, we want to say one thing plainly, without a statistic attached to it. What you're carrying has a name, a biology, and a history of people who fought to have it taken seriously. It is not a character flaw, and it is not the whole of who you are. It is a nervous system that learns something true and useful at the worst possible moment of your life, and is still, faithfully, trying to protect you from a threat that, for most of you watching this, is genuinely over. This series isn't going to promise you a body that forgets. Bodies don't forget. That's not how any of this works, on either side of the argument you've just watched play out. What we're going to chase, episode by episode, is something better than forgetting. We're going to chase what it looks like when the alarm finally learns to trust the all-clear. Next time, what happens when that alarm never switches off at all when a nervous system gets stuck permanently in fight, flight, or the third, quieter response we named earlier in this very episode. Freeze. And what it actually takes to thaw. Episode 2, The Silent Alarm. There is a woman who has not fully exhaled in 11 years. She doesn't know that about herself. Nobody tells you that about yourself. But watch her closely enough, in an ordinary, unremarkable moment waiting for a kettle to boil, sitting at a red light. And you'll see it, the shoulders that never quite drop, the breath that stays high and shallow in the chest, the eyes that check the door before they check anything else in the room. Her body is not resting. It hasn't been resting for over a decade. And she has absolutely no idea, because this has become, for her, simply what normal feels like. This is the episode about the alarm that never turns off. Not the loud one, we've met that one already. This is about its quieter, stranger, more exhausting cousins, the alarm that hums so continuously in the background that a person stops hearing it as an alarm at all and starts hearing it as their own personality. Part 1, 4 doors, 1 hallway. When your nervous system meets something it reads as a threat, it doesn't have infinite options. Broadly, it has 4. Fight, confront it. Flight, escape it. Freeze, go still and wait. And a 4th, added to the clinical vocabulary more recently than the other 3, fawn, appease it, soothe it, and make yourself small and agreeable enough that it has no reason to hurt you. All 4 are ancient. All 4 are, in the right circumstance, exactly the right call. A body that fights off a genuine attacker survives. A body that flees a burning building survives. A body that freezes and goes unnoticed by a predator that hunts by movement survives. A body that fawns its way through an unpredictable, dangerous caregiver, avoiding the outburst that might otherwise come, survives. The problem this episode is built around isn't that these responses exist. It's what happens when one of them gets stuck in the on position long after the danger that trained it has ended, when a nervous system that once needed to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn to survive a specific threat starts applying that same setting to a life that, on paper, is now safe. Part 2, The Man Who Named the Alarm. Before we go further, it's worth knowing where the words fight or flight actually came from, because the story is older and stranger than most people assume. In 1915, a Harvard physiologist named Walter Cannon published a book with an almost gothic title. Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage, describing years of research into what happens inside an animal's body under acute threat. Cannon found that a surge of adrenaline reorganizes the entire body in seconds, blood shifts away from digestion and toward the muscles and lungs, the heart speeds up, blood sugar floods the system for immediate fuel, and blood vessels in the skin constrict to minimize bleeding if the body is wounded. He called this the sympathico-adrenal system, and he coined the phrase that would outlive almost everything else he published, fight or flight. What's less well known is that a contemporary of Cannon's, the Swiss physiologist Walter Hess, discovered the mirror image of this system in the 1930s, stimulating specific brain regions in laboratory animals and finding the exact opposite of Cannon's emergency response: muscles relaxing, breathing slowing, and heart rate dropping. Hess's work, decades before polyvagal theory gave it a modern vocabulary, was already pointing at the same basic architecture: a nervous system with a genuine accelerator and a genuine brake, built by evolution long before anyone had a word for either. Cannon himself, notably, went on to serve in both world wars, studying what he called wound shock in soldiers, watching, firsthand, what happens when a body's emergency system is activated not for seconds, but for months, without reprieve. He was, in a real sense, one of the first scientists to watch the alarm. This entire episode is about get stuck in the on position, decades before PTSD had a name to describe it. Part 3, the theory behind the hallway and the fight over it. To understand how clinicians talk about this today, you need to understand an idea that has become enormously influential and, as of this year, is in the middle of one of the more heated scientific arguments in the entire field. For decades, the standard model of the autonomic nervous system had two settings: sympathetic, which speeds things up, and parasympathetic, which slows them down. Simple. Two pedals, gas and brake. In the 1990s, researcher Stephen Porges proposed something more complicated, called the polyvagal theory. He argued the parasympathetic brake wasn't one system but two, organized in an evolutionary hierarchy. A newer branch, which he called the ventral vagal system, supports calm, social connection, and safety. An older, more primitive branch, the dorsal vagal system, is responsible for a much more drastic response: shutdown, collapse. The freeze response, at its most extreme, not just pausing, but a kind of biological power down. This idea reshaped trauma therapy. It gave clinicians language for something they'd been observing for years without a clean framework: why some trauma survivors don't look anxious at all. They look flat, absent, gone, in a way that's hard to name, even while their body is still sitting right in front of you. And here's where this documentary has to stop and be honest with you again, the same way we were in episode 1. Because this year, in an escalation most people outside the research world haven't heard about, 39 independent experts in vagal physiology and vertebrate evolution. Many of them, scientists whose own work had previously been cited as supporting polyvagal theory, co-authored a paper with a blunt title: Why Polyvagal Theory is Untenable. Their argument, in short, is that the specific anatomical claims underlying the theory, particularly which nerve pathways do what, don't hold up against current knowledge of vagal anatomy. Porges has pushed back hard, in detail, in the same academic journals, calling the critiques misrepresentations that misunderstand the theory's actual claims. This argument is not settled. It is happening right now, in real time, while this episode is being written. We're telling you this not to undermine a framework a great many clinicians find genuinely useful. We're telling you because the honest scientific position this year is that polyvagal theory remains one of the most widely used clinical frameworks in trauma therapy, and its precise neuroanatomical foundations are under serious, live scientific dispute. Both things are true at once. A framework can be clinically useful to therapists and patients and still have contested science underneath it, and pretending otherwise, in either direction, would be a disservice to you. What's not seriously disputed, by anyone in this argument, is the basic clinical observation the theory was built to explain: that trauma survivors experience distinct states of activation and shutdown, that these states are not chosen, and that they can become stuck. The argument is about the wiring diagram underneath that observation, not about whether the observation itself is real. Part 4, the window. There's a simpler, less contested framework worth introducing here, because it's the one that will do the most work for you as you watch the rest of this series. It's called the window of tolerance, developed by psychiatrist Daniel Siegel. Picture a vertical strip. In the middle of that strip is a zone, not too activated, not too shut down, where a person can think clearly, feel their emotions without being overwhelmed by them, and respond to what's actually happening rather than to what happened years ago. That's the window. Above the window is the territory of fight and flight hyperarousal, a nervous system flooded, reactive, and unable to reason its way to calm no matter how hard the person tries. Below the window is the territory of freeze and In its more chronic, quieter form, von hypoarousal, shutdown, a nervous system that has essentially pulled the plug rather than risk overload. Trauma, repeated over time, tends to narrow this window. It shrinks the safe middle ground and expands the two danger zones on either side, so that smaller and smaller provocations are enough to knock a person out of it entirely. That's why a person carrying old trauma can seem, to people who don't understand what they're watching, wildly disproportionate in their reactions, furious at something minor or numb through something significant. They're not overreacting. Their window got smaller a long time ago for reasons that made complete sense at the time. Part 5, Fight or Flight in an Ordinary Life. Let's walk through what these 4 responses actually look like when they become chronic, not in a crisis, but on an ordinary Tuesday. Chronic fighting rarely looks like violence. More often, it looks like a short fuse in traffic that seems wildly out of proportion to the honk that triggered it. It looks like a colleague who reads every piece of feedback as an attack and responds accordingly. Underneath, it's frequently not anger at all, it's fear, wearing anger's clothing, because anger feels more survivable than fear does. Consider a composite drawn from common clinical patterns. A manager, early 40s, known throughout his office for a temper that seemed to arrive from nowhere over minor scheduling conflicts. In therapy, the pattern traced back to a childhood home where unpredictability itself was the threat, where the only way to feel a shred of control was to get louder, faster, first. His adult nervous system had simply kept doing the one thing that had ever worked. Chronic flight rarely looks like literally running away. It looks like the person who has never once, in a decade of working 11-hour days, taken a real vacation, because stillness is where the feelings they've been outrunning finally catch up. It looks like relationships that reliably end right around the point they need to get more vulnerable, not because the person doesn't want closeness, but because closeness is where the nervous system perceives the most risk. And underneath both, there's a real, measurable biological cost. Research on heart rate variability, a marker of how flexibly the nervous system can shift between activation and calm, consistently finds that chronic stress and anxiety are associated with lower vagal tone. The nervous system is stuck closer to the accelerator, with a compromised ability to find its way back to the brake. A major 2025 synthesis of cardiovascular research found that a specific, low HRV signature was associated with as much as double the risk of a serious cardiac event. This isn't a metaphor about a broken heart. For a nervous system living permanently in fight or flight, it can become a literal one. Part 6, Freeze and its quieter relative. Freeze gets less airtime in popular culture than fight or flight, and that's a real problem, because it's arguably the most misunderstood of all 4 responses and the one most likely to be quietly mistaken for a character flaw. At its most acute, freeze is the deer in headlights moment, hypervigilant, motionless, waiting to see whether fighting or fleeing becomes viable. But researchers have also identified something further down the same spectrum, a kind of biological last resort, when neither fighting nor fleeing seems remotely possible. The body goes limp. In some cases, it dissociates entirely, a felt sense of leaving the body, watching events from a distance, so that the worst of an unsurvivable moment happens, in some sense, to someone else. This is why freeze is so often tangled up with shame. Survivors of assault, in particular, frequently describe a specific, painful confusion. Why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I run? The honest answer, biologically, is that in that specific moment, their nervous system made a calculation. Not a conscious one, not a choice in any meaningful sense of the word, that freezing offered the best odds of survival. That calculation happened faster than I thought. It cannot be argued with after the fact, and it should never be treated as evidence of consent, weakness, or choice. Chronically, freeze can settle into something clinicians increasingly call functional freeze, a person who looks, from the outside, entirely capable, showing up, performing, meeting deadlines while feeling, on the inside, essentially absent from their own lives. Autopilot, indefinitely extended. Picture a composite case, a graduate student, mid-20s, who described years of sitting through lectures, exams, and entire relationships with the sense that she was watching her own life through glass, unable to feel much of anything, good or bad, in real time. She wasn't depressed in the way the word usually gets used, she wasn't sad. She simply wasn't fully present for her own life, and she had gotten so used to that absence that she'd stopped noticing it as unusual. It is one of the least visible forms of suffering in this entire series, precisely because it doesn't look like suffering. It looks like getting by. Part 7, the one nobody talks about. The fourth response, fawn, was named clinically more recently than the other three, coined by psychotherapist Pete Walker to describe a pattern he saw again and again in survivors of chronic childhood trauma, particularly trauma involving an unpredictable or threatening caregiver. Fawning is appeasement as a survival strategy. If you cannot fight the threat and cannot flee it, and freezing won't make it lose interest, there's a fourth option: become so agreeable, so helpful, so attuned to what the threat wants, that it has no reason to hurt you. In a genuinely dangerous relationship, this can be a real, effective, life-preserving strategy. The trouble comes later, chronically, when the danger is gone, but the pattern remains. Fawning, grown into an adult personality, doesn't look like fear. It looks like being a remarkably kind, agreeable, endlessly accommodating person is praised for it, often, by everyone around them. It can take years of therapy for someone to recognize that their compulsive selflessness isn't generosity freely given. It's a nervous system still negotiating for safety with people who were never actually going to hurt them. Picture a composite case, drawn from common clinical presentations: a woman in her 30s, the person everyone in her friend group calls first in a crisis, who cannot remember the last time she asked anyone for help with her own. In therapy, she described growing up with a parent. Moods could shift without warning, and how she'd learned, very young, to read a room before she'd learned to read a book, scanning a face for the earliest signs of anger, adjusting her own behavior half a second before the storm arrived, and becoming so good at prevention that the eruptions became rare. It worked. It kept her safer than fighting or fleeing ever could have. It also meant that, 30 years later, she had built an entire adult identity around anticipating everyone else's needs and had genuinely lost track of what her own were. There's a gendered pattern researchers and clinicians have noted here worth naming honestly. Fawn and freeze responses appear disproportionately among women, and some clinicians point to gender socialization as a likely contributor. Girls are frequently rewarded, from very early childhood, for exactly the behaviors that make up a fawn response: agreeableness, emotional caretaking, and self-erasure. What looks like a personality trait, in other words, sometimes turns out to be a trauma adaptation that a culture happened to find convenient. Part 8, when the alarm gets the wrong diagnosis. There's a specific, consequential place where this episode's subject collides with childhood in a way that deserves its own honest look: attention. A great many children carrying chronic hypervigilance nervous systems constantly scanning a classroom, a home, a hallway for the earliest sign of danger present, with symptoms that look on a standard checklist, remarkably like ADHD. Difficulty concentrating, restlessness, impulsivity, distractibility. A growing body of research has documented significant symptom overlap between childhood trauma and ADHD, and clinicians increasingly warn that the two are being confused in real consulting rooms, not just in theory. To be precise about what the evidence actually shows, because this is an area where it's easy to overstate the claim, trauma does not appear to directly cause ADHD as a distinct neurodevelopmental condition. But chronic stress and hypervigilance can produce a set of behaviors: a child who can't sit still, who can't focus on a worksheet, who seems perpetually elsewhere, that looks identical to ADHD on the outside for a completely different underlying reason. A child scanning a chaotic or frightening home for danger 14 hours a day does not have much attention left over for a spelling test the next morning. That is not a deficit of attention. It is attention, working exactly as designed, pointed at the wrong target for a modern classroom. Because it was trained in an environment where that vigilance was the only thing keeping the child safe. This matters enormously for treatment, because the standard response to ADHD and the standard response to trauma are not the same thing, and a child treated only for the former, when the latter is the real driver, may see limited improvement no matter how carefully the medication is dosed. Responsible clinicians increasingly call for trauma history to be part of any thorough attention-related assessment in children, not to replace ADHD as a genuine, separately real neurodevelopmental condition that a great many children have on its own merits, but to make sure a hypervigilant nervous system doesn't get handed the wrong name, and, as a result, the wrong kind of help. Part 9, what all four have in common. Here's the through line worth holding on to across all four of these patterns: none of them is voluntary, and none of them is a character flaw. When a genuine threat activates the amygdala, research has consistently shown, it effectively takes the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning, decision-making part of the brain offline. In the moment a trauma response fires, the rational brain is not driving. The survival brain is. That was true the first time it happened, under real threat, and it remains true years later, when the same response fires under a threat that only resembles the original one. This is worth saying directly to anyone watching who recognizes themselves in this episode. The fact that your body still does this is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that something, once, was seriously wrong around you, and your nervous system built the most competent response it could with the information and options it had at the time. Part 10, the nerve itself, directly. There's one more thread of current research worth including here, because it takes the idea of calming the alarm as literally as science currently knows how, intervening on the vagus nerve directly, rather than only through breath, movement, or talk. Vagus nerve stimulation, delivered through a small implanted or external device, has been studied as a way to directly dampen the amygdala's threat response from the outside, essentially delivering a physical signal to the body's calming pathway rather than waiting for breathing exercises or therapy to get there indirectly. Research reviewed in major psychiatric journals describes it as a promising avenue specifically because it targets the same overactive amygdala circuitry this series keeps returning to, though the evidence base remains earlier stage than for EMDR or trauma-focused talk therapies, and it is not currently a frontline recommendation. We mention it not because it's ready for widespread use, but because it illustrates something important about where this field is heading. Increasingly, researchers are trying to intervene in the nervous system itself, mechanically, directly treating the alarm not as a metaphor to be talked through but as an actual physical circuit that can, potentially, be recalibrated with the right tool. Whether that turns out to be the future of trauma treatment or a promising dead end is, honestly, still being determined. We'll return to this frontier in a later episode, once there's more evidence to responsibly report. Part 11, Borrowing Someone Else's Calm. There's one mechanism of regulation this episode hasn't named yet, and it may be the oldest one humans have, another person. Co-regulation is the process by which one nervous system helps settle another, a parent's steady voice calming a frightened toddler, a friend's calm presence talking someone down from a panic spiral, or even simply being in a room with someone whose own nervous system is regulated enough to, in effect, lend you some of its stability. Human beings are not designed to self-regulate in isolation, especially not in the aftermath of trauma. We are designed, evolutionarily, to borrow calm from each other, long before we're able to generate much of it alone. This is precisely why isolation is so often both a symptom of chronic hyperarousal or shutdown and a multiplier of it. A nervous system stuck in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn frequently pushes away the exact resource-safe, steady human connection that would help it heal, either because hypervigilance makes closeness feel dangerous, or because shutdown makes closeness feel like too much effort to reach for, or because fawning has quietly taught the person that connection always comes at the cost of their own needs. The 4 responses this episode has spent its runtime describing don't just affect the person experiencing them. They shape, often without anyone noticing why, the entire relational world around that person. Partners who feel perpetually kept at arm's length, children who learn to read a parent's dysregulation before they learn to read anything else, and friendships that quietly become one-directional because one person never learned how to receive care, only to give it. This is not a reason for guilt on either side of any of those relationships. It's a reason for understanding and for recognizing that healing a nervous system rarely happens in isolation because it was rarely broken in isolation either. Every therapy this series discusses, the ones with strong evidence and the more experimental ones alike, works, at some level, by providing exactly this, a genuinely safe relationship, therapeutic or otherwise, repeated often enough that a dysregulated nervous system finally has real, felt evidence that closeness can be safe again. Part 12, What actually widens the window? So what does the evidence say about repair, about widening a window of tolerance that trauma has narrowed? The goal, clinicians increasingly emphasize, is not to eliminate fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. These are useful, even essential, in genuinely dangerous moments, and no amount of therapy should or could switch them off entirely. The goal is recalibration, helping the nervous system respond to an actual, present threat, rather than firing automatically at anything that merely resembles an old one. Heart rate variability biofeedback, where a person watches a real-time readout of their own heart rhythm and practices slow-paced breathing to shift it, has real evidence behind it as a tool for rebuilding vagal flexibility. A 2025 scoping review of the technique found consistent improvements in autonomic regulation and stress resilience across the studies examined. It's unglamorous, mechanical, almost boring in its simplicity, 6 breaths a minute, watched on a screen, and that mechanical simplicity is exactly why it works. You cannot argue your nervous system out of hyperarousal. You can, with enough repetition, breathe it there. The therapies named in episode 1, EMDR, trauma-sensitive yoga, and somatic experiencing, all do a version of the same underlying work described in this episode's language. They give the nervous system enough repeated, embodied evidence of safety that the window, slowly, begins to widen again. None of it is instant. None of it is guaranteed to work identically for every person. Every response pattern, every history. But the direction of the evidence is consistent. A nervous system that learned these responses through repetition can, with different repetition, learn new ones. Part 13, The Woman Who Finally Exhaled. Go back to the woman at the start of this episode, 11 years without a full exhale and no idea that's what she'd been doing. Picture, now, a specific moment months into treatment, a therapist asking her to simply notice her breath, nothing more, and her realizing, for what she later described as the first time in memory, that her shoulders had actually dropped. Not forced down. Dropped, the way shoulders are supposed to sit when nothing is currently trying to kill you. She reportedly said it felt less like relaxation and more like grief, a sudden, physical recognition of exactly how long she'd been somewhere else. That moment is what this episode has been chasing the whole way through. Not the absence of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Those will always be part of a functioning nervous system, ready for the day they're genuinely needed again. What changes in real recovery is the size of the window around them. The range of ordinary life a person can move through without their body mistaking it for the war that ended years ago. Consider, too, what this means for how we watch the people around us: the coworker with the short fuse, the friend who never sits still, the family member who seems to have vanished somewhere behind their own eyes years ago, and the endlessly accommodating person who cannot recall the last time they said no to anything. This episode is not asking you to diagnose anyone. It's asking you to consider a single, humbling possibility: that behavior you've spent years finding frustrating, or flaky, or overly intense, or suspiciously agreeable, might be the visible edge of a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do, responding to a threat that, for everyone in the room except that one person's body, ended a long time ago. This is what self-mastery actually looks like, at the level of biology, not aspiration, not a person who no longer has an alarm system. A person whose alarm system has finally learned, through evidence rather than instruction, the difference between then and now. Not a nervous system silenced, but one finally, patiently, believed. Next time, what happens when the alarm doesn't just misfire but scrambles the story it's supposed to be protecting? When trauma fragments memory itself, and a person can carry around their own conscious mind cannot fully narrate. Episode 3, Lost in Translation. Ask her what happened, and she can't tell you. Not because she won't. Because the story, as a story, isn't there. What's there instead? The smell of a specific hand soap, which makes her stomach drop for no reason she can name. A particular tone of male voice, mid-register, slightly raised, that sends her heart rate up before she's consciously registered a word of what's being said. A blank stretch of time, roughly a year of her adolescence, that she knows she lived through. There are school photos, report cards, proof, and that she cannot access as memory in any way that feels like remembering. She has fragments. She does not have a narrative. And for a long time, she assumed that meant something was wrong with her memory. It doesn't. It means something happened to the part of her brain whose entire job is turning experience into story. This is the episode about what trauma does to memory itself, not just what it feels like to remember something painful, but what happens when the mind, in the middle of the worst moment of a person's life, simply declines to file the experience the way it files everything else. Part 1, 2 kinds of remembering. To understand what's fractured, you first need to understand what memory looks like when it isn't. Researchers broadly distinguish 2 memory systems. Explicit memory is the one we usually mean when we say, remember, a conscious, narratable account, this happened, then this, on this day, in this place. It has a beginning, middle, and end, and you can choose to think about it or not. Implicit memory is older, stranger, and entirely different. It's the memory in your hands that still knows how to ride a bicycle decades after you last tried. It's the flinch before you've consciously registered the loud noise. It doesn't come with a story attached. It doesn't ask permission before it surfaces. It simply activates a feeling, a sensation, or a bodily response with no accompanying sense of, I am remembering something. It just feels like the present moment is urgently, physically, real. Under extreme stress, researchers have found, something specific happens to how an experience gets encoded. Elevated physiological arousal interferes with the kind of conceptual processing. Explicit memory depends on the part of the brain responsible for stitching sensory details into a coherent, time-stamped story struggles to do its job while the threat response system is fully activated. The sensory fragments still get recorded, the smell, the sound, the specific quality of light, but the narrative thread that would normally hold them together, in order, with context, frequently doesn't form the way it would under ordinary circumstances. This is why trauma memories so often surface not as stories but as fragments, a flash of an image, a physical sensation, a feeling with no plot. Clinicians who study this describe intrusive trauma memories as consisting mainly of brief sensory pieces, visual flashes, bodily sensations arriving without the organizing context that would let a person say clearly, this is a memory from the past, and it is over. Instead, it often arrives feeling like now. Part 2, when the filing system itself goes dark. Some survivors describe something even further along this spectrum than fragmentation, whole stretches of time that seem to be simply missing. In one clinical study of patients with dissociative identity disorder, nearly all of whom had documented histories of severe childhood abuse, the overwhelming majority reported a period of amnesia for their traumatic experiences. And tellingly, when those memories did eventually surface, almost none of the patients described them returning as a story. They came back the way they did. Implicit memory always comes back as somatosensory flashbacks, a physical sensation first, a narrative, if it ever fully arrives, only much later, and only with considerable work. This raises one of the genuinely hardest questions this series has to sit with, and we're not going to pretend it has a simple answer, because it doesn't. What actually happens, biologically, when a memory seems to go missing? And can it reliably come back? Part 3, a Century Old Retreat. The argument this episode is about to walk into isn't new. It's over 100 years old, and it began with one of the most consequential reversals in the entire history of psychology. In the 1880s, working in Paris under the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, the young Sigmund Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer began treating patients with what was then called hysteria, physical symptoms with no discoverable physical cause. By the mid-1890s, Freud had arrived at what he called his seduction theory, the idea that these symptoms traced back to repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, memories the conscious mind had sealed away because they were too unbearable to hold. And then, within a few years, Freud abandoned it. He came to believe that many of the abuse accounts his patients described weren't memories of real events, but unconscious fantasy, and he redirected the entire emerging discipline of psychoanalysis away from real, external trauma and toward internal conflict and desire instead. Historians still debate exactly why he reversed course, and the debate itself has never fully settled. What's not in question is the consequence, a retreat, at the very founding moment of modern psychiatry was marked by taking survivors' accounts of real abuse at face value. Freud's contemporary, Pierre Janet, took the opposite path and never abandoned it. Janet spent his career studying what he called fixed ideas, traumatic material he believed could be split off from ordinary consciousness, stored as sensory fragments or automatic behaviors rather than as language, and capable of intruding later without warning. Janet's framework, largely eclipsed by Freud's for most of the 20th century, is essentially the direct ancestor of the way clinicians describe dissociation today. For roughly 60 years afterwards, serious psychiatric interest in the psychological effects of trauma nearly disappeared from the field entirely, not because clinicians stopped seeing it but because the discipline had turned its attention elsewhere. We're telling you this because the argument at the center of this episode didn't appear from nowhere in the 1990s. It's the same fault line, opened over a century ago, between two questions that still haven't been fully answered: can real trauma be sealed away from consciousness and later retrieved? And how do we tell that apart, reliably, from a memory that formed some other way? Part 4, The Memory Wars. Here is where this episode has to slow down and be more careful than almost anywhere else in this series, because the honest answer to that question sits at the center of one of the most bitter, consequential scientific and legal disputes in the entire history of modern psychology, a conflict researchers themselves call, without exaggeration, the memory wars. On one side, a clinical tradition, dating back over a century, holds that some traumatic memories can be dissociated or repressed, pushed outside conscious awareness by their own overwhelming nature and later recovered, often in therapy. This view is supported by real clinical observation, patients who report genuine, functionally significant amnesia for documented traumatic events and who later recall those events in ways that feel, to them and their clinicians, entirely authentic. On the other side is a large and vocal body of memory scientists, researchers like Elizabeth Loftus, Richard McNally, and Henry Otgar, publishing as recently as this year, who argue there is no reliable scientific evidence that traumatic memories can be repressed in this way, and that the neuroscientific studies sometimes cited in support of dissociative amnesia don't hold up under scrutiny. Their concern isn't abstract. In the 1980s and 1990s, a wave of recovered memory therapy using techniques like hypnosis and guided imagery to help patients recover suspected repressed memories led to a documented number of cases where people came to believe, with complete sincerity and no intent to deceive, that they had recovered memories of abuse that further investigation strongly suggested had never happened. Some of those cases led to real families being torn apart, and in at least some documented instances, real people were wrongly convicted. We are naming both sides of this as clearly as we can because both sides are arguing from real evidence and real consequences, and because a documentary that picked one side here would be doing exactly what both camps accuse each other of, letting belief get ahead of what the science actually supports. The most careful researchers on the memory science side aren't claiming trauma survivors invent their abuse, and they're not claiming memory gaps aren't real. Ordinary forgetting and confusion about the order and detail of distressing events are extremely well documented and are not remotely the same claim as full repression. What they're specifically disputing is a much narrower, more specific mechanism, whether the mind can fully block a traumatic memory from consciousness and then reliably retrieve it later, intact, the way some clinical models propose. The most responsible clinical position, and the one major professional bodies now recommend, threads this needle carefully. Therapists are advised to avoid walking into a session with preconceptions about what a patient's symptoms mean, to avoid suggestive techniques that risk shaping a memory rather than uncovering one, and to treat memory recovered or otherwise as something to be held with care rather than certainty, particularly outside the therapy room, in contexts like legal testimony where the stakes of being wrong run in both directions, wrongly disbelieving a real survivor or wrongly convicting an innocent person based on a memory that formed, however sincerely, in response to suggestion rather than experience. Part 5, What Isn't Actually in Dispute. It's worth being precise here because it would be easy to walk away from that last section thinking trauma and memory are simply unknowable. It isn't. A great deal is well established. Nobody in this debate seriously disputes that traumatic events are, in general, well remembered, often unusually vividly, in fact, which is precisely what makes intrusive flashbacks so distressing. Nobody disputes that memory in general is reconstructive rather than a fixed recording, prone to gaps and drift over time, in traumatic and non-traumatic memories alike. And nobody disputes the basic clinical picture we opened this episode with, that trauma frequently gets encoded in fragmented, sensory, poorly time-stamped form, arriving later as flashback rather than narrative. The dispute is specifically about the narrower, more dramatic claim, full, then recovered repression, not about whether trauma disrupts memory at all. It clearly, measurably does. Part 6, When the Self Itself Splits. There's a further, rarer point on this spectrum worth naming honestly, because it's often sensationalized in film and television in ways that do real damage to public understanding, dissociative identity disorder, in which a person's sense of self appears to organize into what feel like distinct identity states, each sometimes carrying access to different memories. One framework some clinicians use describes this as a split between what gets called an apparently normal part of the personality, the part that handles daily functioning, work, and relationships, and an emotional part, which holds the unprocessed traumatic material and remains hypervigilant to threat. The two, in this model, operate somewhat independently, with the traumatic material periodically breaking through into conscious awareness and overwhelming the more functional, day-to-day self. Consider what this looks like in a composite clinical picture: a patient who functions, by every outward measure, as a capable professional, holds a job, maintains friendships, and pays bills on time, and who, separately, experiences periods that feel, from the inside, like losing time. A conversation she doesn't remember having. Handwriting in her own notebook she doesn't recognize as her own, in style or content. For years before diagnosis, she was treated for anxiety, then depression, then a mood disorder, each label capturing a piece of the picture without naming the organizing pattern underneath: a mind that had learned, very young, to survive an unsurvivable childhood by compartmentalizing it so completely that entire parts of her experience genuinely stopped feeling like they belonged to the same person. Neuroimaging research into this condition remains genuinely early. Some studies have reported structural differences in hippocampal subregions among patients with dissociative amnesia, but researchers examining this evidence base carefully, including work published this year, caution that the findings are inconsistent across studies, that no reliable biological marker for dissociative amnesia currently exists, and that the brain regions implicated vary considerably from one study to the next. This is a condition and a mechanism that remain under real, active scientific investigation, not one this series can respectfully claim to have fully explained. Part 7. Why this isn't just an academic argument. We've spent a long stretch of this episode in genuinely contested territory, and it's worth pausing to say plainly why that matters to you, watching this, rather than to the researchers arguing about it in journals. Because how this question gets answered shapes real decisions. Whether a therapist gently helps a client explore a hazy memory or actively avoids doing so for fear of shaping it, whether a court treats a recovered memory as reliable testimony or as inherently suspect, whether a family reconciles or fractures permanently over a disputed account of the past. This is a live, consequential, unresolved scientific question with real human beings standing on every side of it: the survivor whose account deserves to be believed and the person wrongly accused based on a memory that may have been unintentionally shaped rather than genuinely recovered. Holding both of those realities at once, without collapsing into easy certainty in either direction, is uncomfortable. It's also the only honest place to stand. Part 8, The Myth of the Perfect Recording. There's one more piece of memory science worth including here because it quietly undercuts an assumption most people carry into this topic without realizing it: the idea that vivid, emotional memories, the kind trauma produces, must therefore be accurate ones. Researchers who study what are called flashbulb memories, the vivid, seemingly high-definition recollections people form around shocking public events, have found something consistently humbling: the vividness and the person's confidence in the memory do not reliably predict its accuracy. People recall exactly where they were, exactly what they were wearing, and exactly who told them the news with total conviction, and when those same memories are checked against records made closer to the actual event, significant details are often simply wrong, even in memories the person would swear, under oath, they remembered perfectly. This matters directly to everything this episode has covered. It means vividness is not proof. A trauma flashback that arrives with overwhelming, undeniable physical certainty is not, by that quality alone, guaranteed to be an accurate record of what happened, nor is it evidence that it isn't. Memory, traumatic or otherwise, was never built by evolution to function as a courtroom recording device. It was built to extract meaning and update itself with new information, which is precisely what makes it so useful for living and so complicated for establishing historical fact with certainty after the event. Part 9, Putting the fragments back in order. Given everything we've just walked through, what does the evidence actually support when it comes to treatment, not recovering hidden memories, but helping someone live alongside the fragments they already, undeniably, have? One of the most well-evidenced approaches here is narrative exposure therapy, developed specifically for survivors of severe, repeated trauma, refugees, survivors of organized violence, and others carrying not one traumatic memory but many, tangled together. The method is almost disarmingly simple in concept. With a therapist's guidance, the person constructs what's called a lifeline, a physical rope, marked with symbols for major life events, both painful and joyful, laid out in chronological order. Session by session, they narrate their way along it, in sequence, giving each fragment a place in a coherent timeline rather than leaving it floating, context-free, ready to intrude without warning. The evidence base here is genuinely strong: 18 randomized controlled trials, covering nearly 1,000 participants across wildly different cultural contexts, from earthquake survivors in China to war-affected communities across Africa, consistently show meaningful reductions in PTSD symptoms. The core insight, worth sitting with, is that the treatment doesn't try to produce a single dramatic recovered memory. It does something more modest and, the evidence suggests, more reliable. It takes fragments the person already has and gives them order, sequence, and context, turning scattered sensory intrusions into a story that has a beginning, a middle, and, crucially, an end. Other emerging approaches take a related but more targeted route, working with the biological process of memory reconsolidation, the finding that a memory becomes briefly editable each time it's recalled, before it's restored. One newer intensive protocol, tested in a 2025 clinical trial, compresses trauma-focused work into 6 consecutive daily sessions, aiming to use this reconsolidation window to shift the emotional charge attached to a traumatic memory without requiring the memory to have ever been lost and recovered in the first place. It's early evidence, promising rather than proven. The same honest caveat this series has applied to every frontier treatment so far. Part 10, The Rope, Laid Out in Order. Go back to the woman from the start of this episode, the blank year, the hand soap, the voice that raised her heart rate before she understood why. Picture her, months into a course of narrative-based treatment, laying out her own version of that rope for the first time, not trying to force the missing year to reappear intact, because it may never do that, and forcing it wasn't the goal. Instead, placing what she does have in order, the years before, marked honestly, the blank stretch, marked as a gap rather than erased or invented, and the years after, reconnected to it. Somewhere in that process, she reportedly said, the flashes stopped feeling like ambushes. They started feeling like chapters still difficult to read, but no longer capable of jumping off the page and grabbing her by the throat without warning. That is what this episode has been circling from the start. Not the restoration of a perfect, complete memory, that promise. This series will not make you, because for many people, biologically, it may not be available, and because, as we spent a long stretch of this episode establishing, the science of what can and cannot be reliably recovered remains genuinely, actively contested. What is available, and what the evidence actually supports, is something quieter and, we'd argue, more durable, taking whatever fragments a person actually has and giving them enough order that they stop ambushing the present and start, finally, belonging to the past. Notice, too, what this reframes about a phrase that gets used carelessly, in and out of clinical settings: just remember what happened. For a great many trauma survivors, that instruction assumes a kind of access to their own past that their nervous system, in the moment it mattered most, simply wasn't able to provide. The gaps are not evasion. The fragments are not unreliable. They are the accurate, physical signature of a mind that was doing something else entirely in that moment, surviving rather than filing paperwork for later. That is a specific, hard-won form of mastery too, not mastery over what happened, which nobody gets to have, and not mastery over certainty, which this particular corner of science may never fully hand anyone. Mastery over the shape of the story now, held with appropriate humility about its gaps, still worth telling, and for the first time, finally being told by the person who lived it, rather than intruding on them without their consent. Next time, what happens when the war moves inward, when the body itself, not just the memory, becomes the site where trauma seems to keep fighting, long after the mind has moved on. Episode 4, The Body as Battlefield. She has seen 11 doctors in 6 years. Every scan comes back clean. Every blood work panel comes back normal. And every day, without fail, her body hurts in ways that no test has ever been able to name, let alone explain. Somewhere around doctor number 7, a specialist used a phrase she has never quite forgiven. There's nothing actually wrong with you. He meant it, presumably, as reassurance. She heard it as an accusation. Because something is wrong. She lives inside it every single day. The only thing missing is a scan sensitive enough to see it. This is the episode about what happens when trauma seems to relocate, not stay in flashbacks or nightmares or fear, but settling instead into tissue, into joints, into a gut that never quite calms down. It's also the episode where this series has to be more careful than almost anywhere else, because this exact territory, the border between mind and body, has a long, damaging history of doctors getting it wrong in both directions, dismissing real physical disease as all in the patient's head, and, just as harmfully, insisting every unexplained symptom must have a hidden psychological cause. We're not going to add to that history carelessly. We're going to walk through what the evidence actually supports and say clearly where it doesn't yet reach. Part 1, a cautionary tale, told first on purpose. Before we say anything about trauma and the body, we want to tell you a story about a mistake because this episode's central idea has been badly misused before, and understanding how matters more than almost anything else we'll say today. For much of the 20th century, ulcerative colitis, a severe, physically destructive inflammatory disease of the colon, was classified by mainstream medicine as psychosomatic. Patients suffering from a real, measurable autoimmune disease were told, in effect, that the condition was a manifestation of unresolved psychological conflict. It wasn't until the 1950s, with the discovery that steroid treatment could directly and dramatically improve outcomes, that medicine was forced to reckon with what should have been obvious in hindsight: this was never a disease of the mind wearing the body as a costume. It was, and always had been, a disease of the immune system, with its own biology, deserving direct medical treatment rather than psychological reinterpretation. We open with this story because it is exactly the kind of mistake this episode could make if we're not careful, and because patients with unexplained pain today report hearing versions of the same dismissal that ulcerative colitis patients heard 70 years ago. The lesson isn't that the mind and bodies are unconnected. The evidence you're about to hear says otherwise, clearly. The lesson is that your trauma is showing up in your body, must never become a substitute for careful medical care. Investigation, and must never be used to wave away a symptom a doctor simply hasn't figured out yet. Both things have to be true at once. The mind-body connection is real, and it is not an excuse to stop looking for what else might be going on. Part 2, Who Gets Believed? There's a second cautionary thread worth pulling before we go further, and it connects directly to the woman we opened this episode with. Research consistently finds that women's pain is more likely than men's to be dismissed, minimized, or reframed as emotional rather than physical, a pattern with a specific, ugly history. The same dismissal, medical historians note, that once got an entire category of women's physical symptoms labeled hysteria, a diagnosis literally named for the Greek word for uterus. That history didn't end when the word fell out of use. Today, women with endometriosis, a genuinely painful, physically destructive condition, wait an average of 7 to 10 years for an accurate diagnosis. Studies of emergency and postoperative care consistently find women's reported pain treated as less credible than men's reporting comparable levels, and more likely to be met with a wait-and-see approach rather than immediate, substantial treatment. This matters enormously for how this episode has to be heard. Everything we're about to describe: trauma's real, documented relationship with the nervous system's pain processing, must never be used as one more polished, scientific-sounding reason to stop looking for a physical cause or to tell a patient, especially a woman, that her pain is probably just stress. The evidence in this episode describes a genuine, additional layer of what can happen to pain processing after trauma. It is not, and must never become, a replacement for careful, believing, thorough medical care. Part 3, The Signal That Never Quite Arrives. With that caution firmly in place, here's what the evidence does show. A great many people living with chronic pain, fibromyalgia in particular, also carry a measurable difficulty with something called interoception, the brain's ability to notice and correctly interpret signals from inside the body. Hunger, fatigue, muscle tension. The early, quiet signs of an emotion arriving before it becomes a full feeling. Closely related is a trait researchers call alexithymia, literally, no words for emotion. People with elevated alexithymia can sense that something is happening inside them without being able to name what it is or separate one internal state from another. A 2025 review of chronic pain research found alexithymia significantly more common among people with fibromyalgia and related pain conditions than in the general population, and a separate 2025 study specifically found that alexithymia helped explain the relationship between childhood trauma and the severity of adult fibromyalgia symptoms, not causing the pain outright, but shaping how intensely it was experienced and how much it interfered with daily life. Here's one plausible mechanism researchers are exploring. If a nervous system learned, early and thoroughly, that paying close attention to internal signals was unsafe because those signals, in a frightening or chaotic childhood, often preceded something painful, it may have adapted by quietly turning the volume down on interoception altogether. Useful, even protective, at the time. But a body that has learned not to listen closely to itself has a much harder time catching a problem early, regulating a stress response before it escalates, or accurately distinguishing hunger from anxiety or exhaustion from sadness or muscle tension from a genuine flare of illness. The static isn't gone. It's just harder to read. Consider a composite case, drawn from common clinical presentation, a man in his 40s, diagnosed with fibromyalgia after years of unexplained widespread pain, who told his therapist almost as an aside that he genuinely could not remember the last time he'd been able to say whether he was hungry, tired, or upset without stopping to think hard about it first. He'd learned, growing up in an unpredictable household, to keep his attention outward on his parents' moods, on the emotional temperature of a room because that vigilance was far more urgently useful, for years, than attending to his own internal state. Decades later, the outward vigilance remained fully intact. The inward channel had simply atrophied from disuse, and his body's pain signals, deprived of the ordinary regulation that comes from accurate self-monitoring, had, by several research accounts, grown louder and less specific over time, described by researchers as reduced interoceptive accuracy amplifying, rather than causing, the underlying pain experience. Part 4, The Gut, Listening to Everything. Nowhere is this two-way conversation between brain and body more active, or more actively researched right now, than in the gut. The gut and brain are connected by a dense, bidirectional communication network involving the vagus nerve, hormonal signaling, immune activity, and the trillions of microbes living in the digestive tract collectively known as the gut-brain axis. Research into inflammatory bowel disease has found that chronic psychological stress can measurably trigger flares and worsen it. Outcomes in genuine, biologically real autoimmune gastrointestinal disease, not causing it from nothing, the way the outdated ulcerative colitis theory once wrongly assumed, but interacting with it, in both directions, through documented immune and neurological pathways. Patients with these conditions also show elevated rates of anxiety and depression and, importantly, current research treats this as a genuine bidirectional loop, not a one-way psychological cause. Gut inflammation appears capable of directly worsening mood and anxiety, just as stress appears capable of worsening gut inflammation. This is precisely the kind of nuance this episode is built to protect. Not, your stress causes your gut disease, and not, your gut disease is unrelated to your emotional life, but a real, physiologically documented feedback loop, running in both directions at once, in which trauma and chronic stress are genuine participants without being the sole author of the story. Part 5, When Nothing Shows Up on the Scan. Now to the hardest, most contested part of this episode, chronic pain conditions where imaging and blood work consistently come back clean, and yet the pain is entirely real, often severe, and often disabling. Modern pain science has moved toward a framework called nosoplastic pain that arises not from ongoing tissue damage or inflammation researchers can directly detect but from altered processing within the nervous system itself, a genuine, measurable change in how the brain and spinal cord interpret and amplify signals, sometimes long after any original injury has healed. This framework matters enormously, because it offers something the older, its psychosomatic, framing never did, a way to validate that the pain is completely real and biologically grounded, without requiring a visible lesion to prove it. Chronic pain researchers increasingly describe this as involving genuine changes in brain structure and function patterns of connectivity in regions handling threat evaluation, emotion, and bodily attention that shift measurably in people with persistent pain and which have been observed, in successfully treated patients, to shift back. This is a critical, honest distinction to hold on to. Nosoplastic pain is not imagined pain, and it is not a euphemism for a psychological problem wearing a physical disguise. It's a specific, increasingly well-characterized biological phenomenon in its own right, one where psychological factors like fear, trauma history, and chronic stress appear to play a documented role in amplification, without being the whole explanation and without diminishing how real or how disabling the pain is for the person living inside it. Part 6, A New Chapter in an Old Argument. This entire debate has recently gained a large, urgent, real-world test case. Long COVID and the broader category of post-viral chronic fatigue conditions it has drawn fresh attention to. Millions of people worldwide have described a strikingly familiar pattern after COVID-19 infection: persistent fatigue, pain, cognitive difficulty, and a wide range of other symptoms, often with normal or inconclusive standard test results. And, predictably, given everything this episode has already covered, many of these patients report encountering the same dismissal that chronic pain and fibromyalgia patients have faced for decades, a suggestion that their symptoms are primarily psychological, deconditioning, or anxiety, rather than a genuine physiological aftermath of viral infection. Current research increasingly points toward real, biological mechanisms, documented immune dysregulation, disrupted gut microbiome composition, and measurable alterations in the gut-brain axis this episode has already described, all under active investigation as physical drivers of post-viral illness. This doesn't mean psychological factors and nervous system amplification play no role. The nosoplastic pain framework we've already discussed almost certainly applies to at least some portion of these patients, particularly regarding pain and fatigue amplification over time. But the emerging evidence base treats this the same way. This entire episode has been trauma-related. Pain must be treated as a real, biological condition that may involve nervous system amplification as one contributing factor among several documented physical mechanisms, never as a psychological explanation offered instead of physical investigation. We include this recent chapter because it shows this isn't a settled historical argument confined to the 20th century. The same tension, real disease versus psychological dismissal, and the more honest, harder truth that usually sits somewhere genuinely in between is playing out again, right now, in real time, in clinics treating a genuinely new disease. The lesson from ulcerative colitis in the 1950s is being tested again, live, in the 2020s. Part 7, What actually moves the needle? Given all of that careful groundwork, what does the evidence say about treatment that specifically targets this brain-body amplification loop, rather than either dismissing the pain or endlessly chasing a physical cause that may not be findable? The strongest single piece of evidence here comes from a rigorous 3-arm randomized controlled trial testing an approach called pain reprocessing therapy on patients with chronic back pain, a condition, notably, with no clear ongoing tissue damage in most of the participants studied. Compared against both a placebo condition and usual care, patients receiving pain reprocessing therapy showed dramatic results. 66% were pain-free or nearly pain-free after treatment, with the gains largely holding a full year later. Brain imaging taken before and after treatment showed the effect wasn't just self-report. Regions of the brain associated with evoked pain showed measurably reduced activity, with increased connectivity between prefrontal and sensory regions, suggesting a genuine, trackable shift in how the nervous system was processing the same physical body. The therapy itself works by directly targeting the mechanism this episode has described, helping patients understand, with real evidence rather than reassurance alone, that their pain, while completely real, reflects an overprotective, amplified nervous system signal rather than ongoing tissue damage, and guiding them through structured techniques to reduce the fear response that keeps that amplification loop running. It is, in a very real sense, a treatment for a nervous system that never got the message the danger had passed. The same core mechanism this entire series keeps returning to, applied here directly to pain. Trauma-focused therapies named earlier in this series show up here too. EMDR, originally developed for PTSD, has an expanding body of research exploring its use for pain conditions with clear trauma histories, including chronic back pain, and trauma-sensitive yoga's evidence base covered in episode 1 includes exactly the kind of interoceptive retraining this episode has been describing, gently, gradually teaching a nervous system that has learned to mute its own internal signals how to listen to them again, safely, at a pace it can tolerate. Mindfulness-based approaches occupy similar territory, and for a similar reason, much of their documented benefit for chronic pain appears to come not from relaxation alone, but from structured, repeated practice, noticing bodily sensations without immediately reacting to them with fear, the exact interoceptive skill this episode has identified as commonly disrupted after trauma. None of these approaches claims to eliminate pain that has a genuine, ongoing physical cause, and none of them should ever be offered as a substitute for ruling one out first. What they consistently show, across genuinely rigorous trials, is a real, replicable capacity to retrain an overprotective nervous system's relationship to pain signals that persist after tissue has healed or that were never fully explained by tissue damage to begin with. Part 8, The Woman and Her 11 Doctors. Go back to the woman from the start of this episode. 11 doctors, 6 years, a specialist's dismissal she has never forgiven. Picture doctor number 12, not someone who tells her the pain isn't real and not someone who tells her it's simply trauma made visible either. Someone who tells her both things are true and neither one cancels the other out, that her nervous system may genuinely be amplifying real pain signals, shaped in part by a body that learned, early, not to trust its own internal weather report, and that this is a legitimate biological phenomenon with legitimate, evidence-based treatment, not a moral failing or a diagnosis of last resort handed to her because nobody could find anything else. Picture her, months into pain reprocessing work, noticing, really noticing, for what feels like the first time in years, the difference between the tension in her shoulders and the ache in her lower back, learning to trace one back to a specific stressful phone call and the other to nothing in particular at all. That distinction, small as it sounds, is the entire episode in miniature, a body relearning how to report accurately on itself, after years of static. Picture, too, what it would have meant for her if Doctor Number 2, or 5, or 7, had understood the difference. This episode spent its opening minutes insisting on, that a nervous system explanation for pain is not the same thing as a dismissal of it, and that believing a patient's pain is real does not require finding a lesion to point to first. Every framework in this episode, interoception, the gut-brain axis, nosoplastic pain, and pain reprocessing therapy, exists specifically to give doctors and patients a way to take unexplained pain seriously without either inventing a physical cause that isn't there or waving the patient's suffering away as imaginary. That is not a small thing to offer someone who has spent 6 years being quietly told, in a dozen different ways, that she was the problem. This is what mastery looks like here, not victory over pain, which this series will not promise anyone, and not a tidy explanation that resolves every unexplained symptom into a trauma narrative, which would be exactly the overreach we opened this episode warning against. It's something narrower and more honest, a nervous system slowly regaining the ability to tell the difference between an old wound amplifying itself and a new one that genuinely needs attention, and a person, for the first time in a long time, being believed by their own body again and by the people whose job it is to help her listen to it. Next time, what happens when healing finally arrives, not as a single dramatic breakthrough, but as the slow, evidence-based work of therapies this series has named piece by piece, finally brought together into a fuller picture of what recovery actually requires. Episode 5, Pathways Back. She has a folder. Not a metaphorical one, an actual folder, 3 inches thick, tabbed, and color-coded, sitting on her kitchen table. Inside it, printouts about EMDR, a brochure for a yoga studio that specializes in trauma-sensitive classes, a waitlist confirmation for a somatic therapist 12 weeks out, a bookmarked article about a psychedelic clinic 400 miles away, and a sticky note in her own handwriting that just says, in increasingly frustrated capital letters, which one? Nobody warns you about this part. Somewhere between deciding you're ready to heal and actually beginning to, there's a bewildering, exhausting menu, dozens of approaches, each with its own acronym, its own passionate advocates, its own price tag, and its own waitlist. This episode exists because that folder deserves an honest guide, not another pamphlet promising the one thing that will finally fix everything. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is pull together everything this series has named, piece by piece across 4 episodes, put it side by side, honestly, and then walk into the genuine frontier. The treatments are so new the paint is still wet, including one this series has to tell you plainly did not get approved, and one still working out who can actually afford it. Part 1, the map so far. Let's start by laying out what we already know, because by this point in the series, we actually know quite a lot. EMDR remains the most broadly recommended frontline treatment, endorsed by the World Health Organization and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, with genuinely strong evidence behind it. Trauma-sensitive yoga has real, growing trial support, particularly for the interoceptive. Reconnection was covered at length in Episode 4. Somatic experiencing has trial evidence specifically for the body and mind overlap in conditions like chronic pain alongside PTSD. Narrative exposure therapy, covered in Episode 3, has 18 randomized controlled trials behind it, particularly for survivors of repeated, complex trauma. Pain reprocessing therapy, from Episode 4 produced one of the single strongest results in this entire series, 66% pain-free or nearly so, with matching brain imaging evidence. And neurofeedback in vagus nerve stimulation remains genuinely promising, genuinely early, and not yet ready for a frontline recommendation. None of these is competing for a single crown. They target different mechanisms: memory, reprocessing, nervous system regulation, narrative coherence, pain amplification, which is precisely why the evidence increasingly points toward combination and sequencing, rather than a search for one best treatment. A person whose primary struggle is fragmented memory may get more out of narrative exposure therapy first. A person whose body won't stop bracing may need somatic work before their system can tolerate EMDR's more direct memory processing at all. There is no universal first move. There is only a careful, individualized answer to the question this whole series keeps returning to: what, specifically, is this particular nervous system still fighting? Researchers are increasingly trying to formalize this kind of matching rather than leave it to guesswork, examining whether specific symptom patterns, or even specific biological markers, like the heart rate variability signature from episode 2 or the hippocampal volume differences from episode 1, might eventually help predict which patient responds best to which treatment before months are spent finding out by trial and error. This field, sometimes called precision psychiatry, remains genuinely early. But the direction is clear and, we think, encouraging. The goal isn't a single universal protocol. It's a more accurate map of which path suits which nervous system, arrived at faster than the current, often exhausting process of trying one thing, waiting months, and trying another. Part 2, the folder nobody talks about. Before we go further into the frontier, we have to name the reason that the folder on her kitchen table exists at all. Access to any of this is genuinely, unevenly hard. Even the most well-evidenced trauma therapies suffer from real, documented dropout rates. Between 25 and 35% of patients starting frontline treatments like CBT and EMDR don't finish them, often due to cost, scheduling, distance from a qualified provider, or simply the difficulty of the work itself. Specialized trauma therapists cluster in wealthier urban areas, leaving entire regions with months-long waitlists or no qualified providers at all. And every emerging treatment named in the second half of this episode carries the same quiet asterisk: it's promising and currently priced, geographically located, or culturally positioned in ways that put it out of reach for most of the people who need it most. This matters because it would be dishonest for this episode to walk you through gleaming, cutting-edge treatments without saying clearly, the primary barrier to healing for a great many trauma survivors isn't a lack of good options. It's the gap between what exists and what's actually reachable from where they're standing. Part 3, the one this series has to tell you didn't make it. Here's a story about a treatment that looked, for a while, like it might be the biggest breakthrough in this entire field, and about what happened when it met the regulatory process meant to protect patients from exactly that kind of hope outrunning the evidence. MDMA-assisted therapy pairs the drug MDMA with structured psychotherapy sessions, and its earlier trials produced some of the most striking numbers in modern PTSD research. In Phase 2, studies show that over half of the participants no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD after treatment. Phase 3 results pushed that figure higher still. Some trials found roughly 2/3 no longer met criteria after just 3 MDMA sessions, with a majority maintaining that status nearly 4 years later. Numbers like that, in a field where standard treatments leave a third of patients without meaningful relief, understandably generated enormous hope. And then, in August of 2024, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration declined to approve it. Its advisory committee voted 2-9 against the treatment's demonstrated effectiveness and nearly as lopsidedly against the idea that its benefits outweighed its risks under the safety plan proposed. The FDA's formal rejection letter, made public the following year, raised specific concerns: difficulty maintaining a truly blinded trial when participants can generally tell whether they received an intoxicating drug or a placebo, incomplete safety data, and questions about how functional outcome measures were assessed. As of this year, MDMA-assisted therapy remains investigational in the United States, not approved, not available outside a research setting, though government-funded trials through the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs continue enrolling participants, and additional Phase 3 research is underway to address the specific gaps regulators identified. We're telling you this story in full, including the part where it didn't work out the way its advocates hoped, because it's a genuinely important demonstration of how this entire field is supposed to function. Exciting early results are not the same thing as proof. A regulator's job is to ask harder questions than a hopeful trial design can always answer, and sometimes, even for a treatment surrounded by real enthusiasm and real preliminary evidence, the honest answer, for now, is not yet. Consider what this actually meant for a composite of the real people who took part in those trials. A combat veteran, say, who had tried 4 different first-line treatments over a decade with only partial relief, who enrolled in an MDMA trial as what he described as a last resort, and who experienced, across 3 guided sessions, what he called the first time in years he could think about his worst memory without his whole body trying to leave the room. For participants like him, the treatment's rejection wasn't an abstract regulatory footnote. It meant a therapy that had measurably helped him remained, for now, unavailable to the next veteran standing where he'd stood. That tension, real, individual benefit, sitting alongside real, structural uncertainty about the evidence as a whole, is not a contradiction. It's what an honest, unfinished scientific story actually looks like while it's still being written. Part 4, The Other Frontier, Still Being Priced. There's a second, related frontier treatment further along a genuinely different regulatory path because, unlike MDMA, ketamine is already an approved medication, prescribed off-label in this context, which has let ketamine-assisted psychotherapy develop faster, more unevenly, and with considerably less centralized oversight. The early data is genuinely striking. Several small trials have found ketamine infusions producing rapid, measurable reductions in PTSD symptoms. One systematic review found an 80% response rate in patients whose PTSD had resisted conventional treatment, with improvement often visible within 24 hours, a dramatically faster timeline than any therapy previously named. In this series, researchers believe ketamine may work partly by temporarily increasing neuroplasticity, potentially making patients more able to engage with trauma-focused work, like EMDR or exposure therapy, that they'd previously found too overwhelming to tolerate. But the evidence here comes with real caveats this series won't hide from you. Most trials remain small. At least one recent study, examining ketamine in a real-world clinical population, found that adding psychotherapy to ketamine treatment provided no measurable additional benefit over ketamine alone, a genuinely unexpected finding that complicates the tidy story of ketamine as simply an accelerant for talk therapy. And access here is its own serious problem. Research has specifically documented that cost, cultural stigma, and structural barriers disproportionately keep ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is out of reach for people of color and lower-income patients, even as private clinics expand rapidly for those who can afford it. A firefighter in one recent qualitative study described paying not just for the sessions themselves but for the cabs and ferries required to physically reach a clinic, a small, specific detail that captures something large, promising. Science does very little for the person who cannot get in the door. Part 5, The Clinic in Your Pocket. There's one more development worth naming, honestly, because it's reshaping access faster than almost anything else in this episode, the move of trauma treatment onto telehealth platforms and, increasingly, into self-guided apps. Remote delivery of EMDR, trauma-focused CBT, and related therapies has expanded dramatically, offering a real, partial answer to the geographic access problem named earlier in this episode. A survivor in a rural area with no local trauma specialist can now, at least in principle, reach hundreds of miles away without leaving home. Early research on remote delivery of trauma-focused therapies generally finds outcomes broadly comparable to in-person treatment for many patients, though clinicians note it isn't a universal fit. Some patients, particularly those managing dissociation or acute safety concerns, benefit from the physical presence and immediate real-world grounding a therapist's office provides in a way a screen can't fully replicate. Self-guided apps occupy a more cautious tier of this same trend. A growing number offer structured psychoeducation, breathing exercises, and simplified versions of techniques like the heart rate variability biofeedback is covered in episode 2. These can genuinely help as a low-barrier entry point or a supplement to formal treatment, particularly for someone still on a waitlist. What they are not, and what responsible developers of these tools generally don't claim they are, is a substitute for trauma-focused therapy with a trained clinician once real processing work begins. The honest role for this category, right now, is expanding the on-ramp, not replacing the road. Part 6, Healing Isn't Always a Private Room. One more piece of this landscape deserves inclusion because it's easy to overlook amid all this talk of specialized individual therapies, healing that happens in groups and healing that happens through peer support rather than clinical treatment at all. Group-based models including group formats of some of the ketamine-assisted approaches just described have been proposed specifically as a response to the cost barriers this episode just named, spreading the expense of an expensive treatment across a shared, structured group experience while adding something individual therapy cannot fully replicate, the specific, grounding experience of healing alongside other people who understand, firsthand, what you're carrying. This connects directly back to episode 2's discussion of co-regulation, the finding that nervous systems settle each other, not just in a therapist's office, but anywhere genuine safety and shared understanding are present. For many survivors, particularly those from communities where formal mental health care carries real stigma or genuine mistrust earned through historical harm, a peer support group or community-based healing circle may be a more accessible and sometimes more effective first step than a specialized clinical treatment with a four-figure price tag and a 3-month waitlist. Part 7. The treatment has to fit the person, not just the diagnosis. One more dimension of access deserves its own space here, because it's easy to treat as a footnote when it should be central: cultural fit. A therapy validated in trials conducted primarily on one demographic doesn't automatically translate cleanly to every community it's offered to. Research on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, for instance, has specifically documented that collectivist cultural values, family-oriented stigma around mental illness, and justified historical mistrust of medical institutions can all shape whether a treatment that looks excellent on paper actually reaches, or gets accepted by, the people who might benefit from it. This isn't a reason to abandon evidence-based treatment. It's a reason to insist that evidence-based treatment be delivered by clinicians who understand the specific cultural context a patient is coming from, and that research itself continues to diversify who gets studied so that evidence-based doesn't quietly come to mean evidence-based for one demographic, offered to everyone. Part 8. Building your own path. Given everything laid out across this episode and the 4 before it, what does an honest answer to that sticky note, which one, actually look like? It looks less like a single choice and more like a sequence, built with a qualified clinician's guidance, responsive to how a particular nervous system responds along the way. It often starts with whatever is actually accessible geographically, financially, culturally, rather than whatever ranks highest on a research summary, because the single most effective treatment in the world does nothing for a person who can never reach it. It generally benefits from addressing nervous system regulation, the subject of episode 2, before attempting the more direct memory processing at the center of EMDR or narrative work, because a nervous system that hasn't learned any capacity for safety yet often can't tolerate revisiting the material those therapies require. And it. Treat emerging frontier options exactly as this episode has, with real hope and equally real patience, watching the evidence continue to develop rather than betting everything on the newest name in the folder. Part 9, The Folder, Reconsidered. Go back to the woman with the 3-inch folder and the sticky note in increasingly frustrated capital letters. Picture her, a year later, having actually started 6 months of trauma-sensitive yoga first, at a studio 20 minutes from her house, because it was the thing she could actually get to. Then, once her nervous system could tolerate sitting still with a difficult memory without flooding, a course of EMDR with a therapist she'd been matched with through a community mental health center rather than the psychedelic clinic 400 miles away. Not the newest treatment in the folder. Not the one with the most striking statistics. The one that was actually, physically, and financially reachable, sequenced in an order her particular nervous system could tolerate. Notice, too, what her path did not require. It did not require MDMA-assisted therapy to become available. It did not require a clinic to open within driving distance, offering the newest frontier option. Every episode of this series has walked through genuinely exciting emerging science, and every episode has also insisted on the same honest caveat that emerging is not the same as available, and available is not the same as accessible. Her path was built almost entirely from treatments that have existed, in evidence-based form, for years, sequenced thoughtfully rather than chosen for novelty. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth at the center of this entire episode, and it is a form of mastery too, not the mastery of finding a single perfect treatment, which for most people does not exist, but the mastery of building a realistic, sequenced, personally sustainable path back out of whatever combination of tools is actually within reach. The frontier treatments in this episode, MDMA, ketamine, and whatever comes after them, deserve continued, rigorous, honest research, and this series will be watching them closely alongside you. But healing was never going to wait for the frontier to finish arriving. For most people, it starts, and often it's built, from whatever is already sitting within reach. Next time, what happens when the tools finally work not as isolated techniques, but as a body and a mind, slowly and unevenly, learning to trust each other again? Episode 6, Rebuilding the Self. I don't know who I am anymore. It's one of the most common sentences spoken in trauma therapy offices and one of the most misunderstood outside of them. People tend to hear it as poetry, a figure of speech, a dramatic way of saying someone feels sad or lost. It isn't. For a great many survivors of prolonged trauma, it is a literal, structural description of what happened to them. Not a mood. An architecture. The self they might have become, uninterrupted, was never finished being built, and the self standing here now had to be assembled, in a hurry, out of whatever material survival left lying around. This is the final piece this series has been building toward. Not just calming an alarm, not just processing a memory, not just easing a body's pain, but the harder, slower work underneath all of it, rebuilding a person's actual sense of who they are and their belief that they have some real say in who they become next. Part 1, When Trauma Reaches the Foundation. In the 1990s, the psychiatrist Judith Herman, having spent years treating survivors of prolonged trauma, domestic captivity, childhood abuse, political imprisonment, noticed something: the standard PTSD diagnosis wasn't built to capture. Her patients didn't just have flashbacks and hypervigilance. Something deeper had been reorganized: their sense of who they were, their capacity to trust their whole system of meaning about the world and their place in it. She proposed a new category: complex PTSD, or CPTSD, arising specifically from trauma that is prolonged, repeated, and inescapable captivity, in the broadest sense, whether that's a prisoner of war camp or a childhood home. Survivors of this kind of trauma, Herman found, often describe a self that feels permanently damaged, saturated with shame that has nothing rational to do with what was actually done to them. Relationships become a minefield of distrust. And the belief systems that once made the world make sense, that people are basically good, that effort is basically rewarded, that safety is basically achievable, frequently collapse altogether, leaving something closer to a quiet, ongoing grief for a worldview that trauma took along with everything else. It's worth naming honestly where this diagnosis stands today, because it's a genuinely interesting case of medicine catching up slowly to clinical reality. The World Health Organization's Diagnostic Manual, the ICD-11, formally recognized complex PTSD as its own distinct diagnosis. The American Diagnostic Manual, the DSM, still has not. Decades after Herman first proposed it, clinicians in the United States generally work around this by diagnosing PTSD alongside other conditions like borderline personality disorder or dissociative disorders, which Herman herself has argued often obscures a shared traumatic origin that a single, accurate diagnosis would make clear. This gap matters beyond bureaucracy. A person whose suffering doesn't map cleanly onto any single diagnostic box often experiences that mismatch as one more confirmation that something is uniquely, uncategorizably wrong with them, when the truth is closer to the opposite. Their symptoms are a well-documented, increasingly well-understood pattern that the paperwork simply hasn't fully caught up to yet. Part 2, The Map Out. Herman not only diagnoses the problem. She proposed a structure for recovery that remains, decades later, one of the most influential frameworks in the entire field. Not a specific technique like EMDR or narrative exposure therapy, but a sequence, a set of stages. The more specific therapies this series has already covered tend to move through. The first stage is safety, not a metaphor, but a concrete, practical foundation: physical safety from ongoing harm and internal safety, a nervous system capable of the basic regulation covered back in episode 2, before any deeper work can safely begin. Attempting the second stage before the first is solid, clinicians consistently find, tends to re-traumatize rather than heal. The second stage is remembrance and mourning, the work of episode 3, giving fragmented memory a coherent shape, and, crucially, grieving what was actually lost, not just an event, but often years, relationships, a version of a childhood, or a life that trauma took and cannot give back. Herman was insistent that this stage cannot be skipped or rushed. Mourning what happened, in its full weight, is not a detour on the way to healing. It is a required part of the road. The third stage is reconnection, rebuilding a life, a set of relationships, and often a renewed sense of purpose, sometimes channeled into what Herman called a survivor mission, using what was learned, at unbearable cost, in service of something larger, whether that's peer support, advocacy, or simply a hard-won capacity for genuine intimacy that trauma had made one feel impossible. This episode lives almost entirely in that third stage because it's the stage this series hasn't yet spent much time in, and because it's the stage where self-mastery, the phrase framing this entire series, actually gets built. Part 3, Meeting Your Own Parts. One of the more distinctive approaches to this reconnection work has, in the last several years, moved from the margins of trauma therapy toward its center: internal family systems, or IFS, developed by therapist Richard Schwartz in the 1980s and increasingly widely practiced today, with more than 12,000 trained clinicians as of recent counts. IFS starts from a specific, almost countercultural premise, that having a mind organized into distinct, sometimes conflicting internal parts isn't pathology. It's simply how minds work, trauma or no trauma. What trauma does, in this model, is push some of those parts into extreme, frozen roles and exile part carrying unprocessed pain and shame from childhood and a protector part that developed rigid, sometimes self-destructive strategies specifically to keep that pain from ever surfacing again. The work of therapy, in this framework, isn't eliminating these parts or overriding them. It's helping a person access what IFS calls the self, a core state of calm, curiosity, and compassion the model holds to be undamaged by trauma, no matter how severe, and, from that grounded place, build a different relationship with the parts that have been working so hard for so long to protect a wound they were never given the chance to properly heal. We want to be precise here about where the evidence for this approach actually stands, because IFS has grown popular quickly, and popularity and evidence don't always move at the same speed. The first randomized controlled trial specifically testing an IFS-based program for PTSD, a 16-week group program called PARTS, run out of a Harvard-affiliated research center, was published only very recently, and found statistically and clinically significant reductions in PTSD severity, alongside real improvements in self-compassion and emotion regulation, with the program rated highly acceptable by participants. That's a genuinely encouraging result. It's also, honestly, an early one. IFS's own research institute states plainly that larger, more fully powered trials are still needed across the range of conditions it's used for, and by most assessments, its evidence base, while real and growing, remains smaller than the substantial research behind CBT or EMDR. It's also not appropriate for everyone. Clinicians generally advise against it for people experiencing active psychosis or significant difficulty distinguishing reality, since the language of internal parts can, in that specific context, become disorganizing rather than clarifying. Picture what this actually looks like in a composite session: a man in his 50s, in therapy for the first time in his life, describing a familiar pattern, the instant, disproportionate fury that arrived whenever his teenage son questioned him. Through IFS work, he came to recognize that fury was not simply his own anger but a specific protector part, one that had formed decades earlier to shield a much younger version of himself from a father whose own temper had made questioning him dangerous. The work wasn't eliminating the anger. It was, from a calmer, more grounded place, thanking that part for the protection it had once genuinely provided, and gradually negotiating a different, less extreme role for it now that the original danger no longer existed. He described the shift not as the anger disappearing, but as gaining, for the first time, a half-second of space between the trigger and the reaction, just enough room to choose. Part 4, the story you tell about yourself. There's a related, more research-heavy framework worth including here, because it gives this episode's title a precise, testable meaning: narrative identity theory, developed over 3 decades. By psychologist Dan McAdams. McAdams' central claim is that identity itself is, in large part, a story, an internalized, continuously revised life narrative that integrates a reconstructed past and an imagined future into something coherent enough to call a self. Using a structured interview that asks people to describe their life as books, with chapters and turning points, McAdams and his collaborators have found a specific, recurring pattern with real consequences: people whose life stories take the shape of what he calls redemption sequences. A clearly negative scene giving way to a clearly positive one, consistently show higher levels of well-being and psychological maturity than those whose stories trend the opposite direction, from good to bad, a pattern he calls contamination. In one study tracking participants over several years, the shape of the story people told about their own past significantly predicted their mental health trajectory afterwards. We want to add an honest caveat here, because it's exactly the kind of nuance this series keeps insisting on. McAdams and later researchers have noted that the redemption narrative may be a particularly American story shape, culturally inherited rather than psychologically universal, and that cross-cultural research on this pattern remains genuinely uneven. That doesn't undo the finding. It sharpens it. The therapeutic value isn't enforcing every survivor's story into a specific redemptive template. It's in the broader, better supported insight underneath, that consciously, actively authoring your own account of what happened to you rather than remaining a passive character inside a story that only ever happens to you is itself a measurable part of recovery. This is narrative work in a different key from Episode 3's fragmented memory or Episode 5's therapies. It's not about accurately reconstructing what happened. It's about who gets to hold the pen now. Part 5, The Voice That Learns to Be Kind. Running underneath nearly every therapy this series has covered is a quieter, less clinical-sounding thread that turns out to matter enormously: how a person learns to talk to themselves. Self-compassion, defined by researcher Kristen Neff as treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a friend, recognizing suffering as something shared across the human condition rather than a uniquely personal failure, and holding painful feelings with balanced awareness rather than either suppressing them or being consumed by them, has, over roughly 2 decades of research, moved from a soft, secondary idea to a measurable, significant factor in trauma recovery. A 2025 study following over 400 trauma-exposed adults found something particularly striking: self-compassion didn't just correlate with fewer symptoms. It specifically strengthened the relationship between post-traumatic symptoms and post-traumatic growth, the concept introduced back in Episode 1, meaning that even among people carrying significant, ongoing traumatic symptoms, those who had cultivated more self-compassion were more likely to also be experiencing real, measurable growth alongside their pain. This matters directly to the shame Herman described at the center of complex trauma. A great many survivors of prolonged trauma internalize the harm done to them as evidence of their own inherent badness, a coping mechanism, painful as it is, that at least offers a child some illusion of control over an uncontrollable situation. If it's my fault, then maybe I can prevent it next time. Self-compassion work directly targets this internalized verdict, not by arguing a person out of it intellectually, but by practicing, repeatedly, a different internal voice, one capable of holding real pain without adding a second layer of self-judgment on top of it. Part 6, The Return of Choice. There's one more thread essential to this episode's title, and it's the one this whole series has arguably been building toward from its very first scene: agency. The felt, functional sense that you have some genuine say in what happens to you and what you do next. Trauma, almost by definition, is an experience of agency being taken away, a moment, or years of moments, where choice simply wasn't available. The chronic aftermath, for many survivors, is a nervous system that has generalized that lesson far beyond the original situation, a pervasive, often unconscious sense of powerlessness that outlasts the actual danger by years or decades, showing up as passivity, as difficulty making even minor decisions, as a kind of learned deference to whoever seems to be in charge of a room. Every therapy this series has named works, in some sense, to reverse that specific lesson. EMDR gives a person active control over reprocessing a memory that once controlled them. Trauma. Sensitive yoga, from Episode 1, is frequently taught with an emphasis on offering choices: move this way or don't, at your own pace, specifically because that structure of genuine option, repeated in a safe context, begins to retrain a nervous system that learned choice wasn't available. IFS explicitly aims to move a person from being taken over by an extreme parts reaction to consciously choosing, from a grounded place, how to respond. The mechanism varies. The target is the same: rebuilding, through repeated, real, felt experience, a person's functional belief that they are the author of at least some of what happens next. Part 7, The Woman Who Stopped Apologizing. Consider a composite drawn from common patterns in long-term trauma recovery. A woman in her late 30s, several years into treatment that had already included EMDR and trauma-sensitive yoga, who described a specific, almost embarrassingly small moment as the point she felt she'd actually changed. A colleague asked her opinion in a meeting. She gave it directly, without the reflexive apology that had preceded nearly every sentence she'd spoken in a professional setting for as long as she could remember, and nothing bad happened. No punishment arrived. The room simply moved on to the next agenda item. She later described that moment, oddly, as more significant than any single breakthrough session in years of therapy. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was ordinary proof, delivered in the most unremarkable possible setting, that her voice could occupy space in a room without consequence. That is what reclaimed agency actually looks like from the inside, most of the time, not a triumphant declaration, but a small, previously impossible ordinary moment, passing without incident, that a nervous system quietly files away as new evidence about how the world actually works now. Notice, too, how many threads from this entire series converge in that one small moment. The nervous system regulation from Episode 2 is steady enough to speak without flooding. The narrative coherence from episode 3 lets her recognize this moment as new rather than dismissing it as luck. The interoceptive reconnection from episode 4, letting her actually notice she felt safe rather than overriding the feeling out of habit. The self-compassion this episode has just described is quiet enough not to punish herself afterward for having dared to speak. None of it happened in isolation. It rarely does. This is the fullest version of what this series has called self-mastery, arrived at through 5 episodes of biology, controversy, and hard-won evidence, not the absence of a traumatic past, which nobody gets to have, and not a self restored to some imagined, undamaged original state, which for most survivors of prolonged trauma was never fully formed to begin with. Something else a self actively built, part by part, choice by choice, out of the material survival left behind, standing now with a genuine, felt sense of authorship over what comes next. Next time, what real recovery actually looks like, in the words and lives of the people who have walked this entire path, not composites, but the honest, unresolved, ongoing shape of resilience. In practice. Episode 7, Real Stories of Return. For most of the 20th century, the assumption in psychology was simple, and almost nobody questioned it: trauma damages people, more or less permanently, and the best anyone can hope for is a long, difficult road toward partial repair. Sigmund Freud believed it. Several generations of clinicians who followed him believed it too. It seemed, frankly, like common sense. How could living through the worst moment of your life not leave you fundamentally, lastingly changed for the worse? Then, starting in the late 1990s, a researcher at Columbia University named George Bonanno began doing something almost nobody in his field had done before. He tracked large groups of people through potentially traumatic events: bereavement, disaster, combat, serious injury, not just once, but repeatedly, over years, and let the data show him what actually happened, rather than assuming he already knew. What he found overturned decades of assumptions, and it remains, in some clinical circles, quietly controversial to this day. Resilience, not chronic suffering, not a long grinding recovery, turned out to be the single most common response to trauma. In a meta-analysis spanning 54 separate studies, across everything from natural disaster to combat to the sudden loss of a spouse, roughly 65% of people showed a trajectory of few or no lasting psychological symptoms at all. This episode exists to sit inside that finding, honestly, in all its complexity. Not to suggest trauma doesn't matter, this entire series has spent 6 episodes proving, in exhaustive biological detail, that it does. But to show you the actual range of what, afterwards, looks like, for composite stories are each representing one of the 4 trajectories Bonanno's research identified. Some of these stories end somewhere you'd call recovery. At least one of them doesn't, not fully, not yet, and this series is not going to pretend otherwise, because that dishonesty would undo everything the previous 6 episodes worked to build. Part 1, 4 roads, 1 starting line. Before the stories, the map. Bonanno's research identified 4 distinct trajectories people tend to follow after a potentially traumatic event, and understanding all 4 is essential to understanding what real recovery actually looks like in its full, uneven range. The resilient trajectory is the most common, a person who experiences real distress at the time, but whose symptoms never climb into clinically significant territory, and who returns to stable functioning relatively quickly. The recovery trajectory describes people who do experience a genuine period of significant symptoms, sometimes severe, before gradually, over months or years, improving to a stable, healthy baseline. The chronic trajectory describes people whose symptoms remain elevated for years, sometimes indefinitely, without the kind of resolution the word recovery implies. And the delayed trajectory, the least common and perhaps the most counterintuitive, describes people who appear to be doing fine, genuinely fine, not suppressing anything, for months or years, before symptoms emerge later, sometimes triggered by an unrelated stressor that seems to reopen something nobody realized was still unsettled. Every therapy, every mechanism, and every controversy this series has spent 6 episodes explaining lives somewhere inside these 4 shapes. What follows are 4 composite portraits, drawn from common, well-documented clinical patterns rather than any single real person, each illustrating one trajectory, each carrying forward specific threads from earlier in this series. Part 2, the one who was, genuinely, already okay. Her name, for this story, is Amara. She is 31. 4 years ago, the apartment building 2 doors down from hers caught fire in the middle of the night. She woke to sirens, got her downstairs neighbors out through a window, stood on the sidewalk in her pajamas at 3 in the morning watching flames move across a roofline 40 feet from her own, and did not, by any clinical measures researchers have developed, have gone on to develop significant post-traumatic symptoms. In the days immediately afterwards, she describes feeling exactly what episode 1's discussion of the acute stress response would predict: jumpy, oddly tired, replaying the sound of the smoke alarm at odd moments. She assumed, based on everything she'd absorbed from a culture saturated with trauma narratives, that this was the beginning of something, the first act of a story she'd now be living inside for years. A friend, only half joking, told her to brace herself for the PTSD. She waited for it. It never arrived. Within roughly 3 weeks, the jumpiness faded on its own, the intrusive replay of the smoke alarm stopped, and life simply resumed its previous shape, largely intact. This is the story this series has to work hardest to make sure you actually hear, because it runs against nearly everything the previous 6 episodes have described, and against nearly everything popular culture teaches about trauma. Amara isn't suppressing anything. She isn't dissociating from the memory in the sense episode 3 described. She isn't quietly hypervigilant in a way episode 2 would recognize as fight or flight in disguise. Assessed honestly, repeatedly, over years she was, in fact, part of a longitudinal study on urban fire survivors, contacted at 6 months, 1 year, and 3 years afterwards. She shows what Bonanno's research would call a stable, low-symptom trajectory, real distress in the moment, followed by a return to baseline that happened relatively quickly and never really reversed. For a long time, clinicians assumed stories like Amara's were rare exceptions or evidence of denial waiting to surface later. Bonanno's research suggests otherwise. Hers is, statistically, the single most common response to a frightening, genuinely traumatic event. Multiple protective factors appear to matter here, though researchers are careful to note that predicting resilience in advance remains surprisingly difficult. What researchers sometimes call the resilience paradox, where the known protective factors, added together, still explain only a modest amount of who ends up on this trajectory and who doesn't. Among the factors that do seem to matter, Amara had an existing support network she reached out to immediately rather than withdrawing from. She describes calling her sister from the sidewalk while the fire trucks were still there and talking through what she'd just seen in detail within hours rather than months. She had no significant prior trauma history compounding this new event. Episode 1's discussion of prior adversity narrowing the window of tolerance is directly relevant here. In reverse, a wider window to begin with meant this event, frightening as it was, didn't overwhelm it. And she found, relatively quickly, a way to make sense of what happened, not through formal therapy, which she never sought and, by every available measure, didn't need, but through the ordinary human process of talking about it, repeatedly, with people who listened, turning it, within a few months, into a story she could tell at a dinner table without her heart rate changing. There's a further layer worth naming, connecting back to episode 1's discussion of post-traumatic growth. Amara describes the fire as having genuinely, if modestly, changed her priorities. She moved within the year to an apartment with better fire safety, started a habit of checking in on elderly neighbors she'd previously never spoken to, and describes feeling, in her words, less like everything is guaranteed, in a way she experiences as clarifying rather than frightening. This is a mild version of exactly the growth alongside difficulty pattern episode 1 described, arriving without the extended suffering some post-traumatic growth narratives seem to require. Growth and struggle, that episode insisted, are not a package deal. Amara's story is quite evidence of that. Not a package deal, half of that claim. We include Amara's story first, and deliberately, because leaving her out would be its own kind of dishonesty. Not every difficult experience becomes a wound requiring years of work, as this series has documented. Bodies and minds are frequently more resilient than either popular culture or historically, clinical psychology itself gave them credit for. This doesn't diminish anyone else's story. It simply completes the picture. Part 3, the one who walked the long road. His name, for this story, is Marcus. He is 34, the same composite age as Carlos from episode 1, and not by accident. This is, in effect, the fuller version of that story, walked all the way through. Marcus deployed twice. The specific memory that came to define his return home involved a checkpoint, a car that didn't stop when it should have, and a decision made in under 2 seconds. That he has spent the years since replaying in 100 variations, none of which change what actually happened. For 6 years afterwards, as this series described back in episode 1, he didn't sleep through a full night. Overpasses, fireworks, a particular register of raised voice, his body reacted to all of them as though the checkpoint had never actually ended. Marcus's trajectory, in Bonanno's framework, is recovery, real, significant, clinically meaningful symptoms for a genuinely difficult stretch of years, followed by real, measurable improvement. But the texture of how that improvement actually happened matters more than the label, and it's worth walking through in full, because it touches nearly every mechanism this series has spent 6 episodes explaining. It did not start with EMDR. It started, 18 months before his first EMDR session, with something much less dramatic, a VA primary care visit for an unrelated issue, where a nurse practitioner, following a standard screening protocol, asked 2 brief questions about his sleep and his mood, and, based on his answers, referred him to a specialist rather than letting the visit end there. Marcus nearly didn't go. Episode 5's discussion of access barriers was, for him, not abstract. The nearest trauma specialist was 90 minutes from where he lived, and it took 4 months to get an appointment. When treatment did begin, it began with exactly the sequencing episode 5 described as ideal and rarely available, months of work on basic nervous system regulation before anything resembling direct memory processing. A clinician taught him the heart rate variability biofeedback technique from episode 2, the unglamorous, mechanical work of watching his own heart rhythm on a screen and learning, through repetition, to slow it. He described the early sessions as almost insultingly simple. He also, months later, described them as the reason he was able to tolerate what came next. What came next were 10 sessions of EMDR, the same figure cited back in episode 1, and the same honest caveat applies here that applied then. It was not a single dramatic breakthrough. Session 4, he later said, was worse than Session 1, a memory he'd successfully avoided for years surfaced with a clarity that took him a week to recover from. This is worth naming plainly, because recovery stories are so often told as smooth upward lines, and this series has committed, from its first episode, to not doing that. Marcus's actual graph, if you plotted it, would look less like a rising slope and more like a rough staircase, with at least 2 steps that briefly went down before the next one went up. By session 10, something had genuinely shifted. He described driving under an overpass for the first time in years without his hands tightening on the wheel. He also, in the same conversation, described still avoiding fireworks displays entirely not because the treatment failed, but because recovery, in the trajectory Bonanno's research actually documents, rarely means every single symptom resolves completely. It means a return to a stable, functional baseline, which for Marcus included both the overpass he could now drive under and the fireworks display he, still 5 years later, could now enjoy. Later, they choose to skip. He eventually found his way to a version of what episode 6 called a survivor mission, peer support work with other veterans navigating the same 90-minute drive to specialized care he'd once nearly given up on. He describes this work not as fully resolved healing, offered from a position of having arrived somewhere finished, but as an ongoing, active practice of the self. Mastery, this series has returned to again and again, is understood not as a destination but as something closer to a discipline, maintained rather than achieved once and kept forever. There's a piece of Marcus's story that belongs to someone else, and it's worth including, because trauma recovery, as episode 6 discussion of co-regulation insisted, rarely happens in a single isolated nervous system. His wife stayed through all 6 years of the worst of it, the nights he didn't sleep, the 4th of July spent in a closet mentioned back in episode 1, and the short fuse episode 2 would recognize as chronic fights. She has her own account of that period, delivered years later at a support group for military spouses. Watching someone you love disappear behind their own eyes for years, she said, and not knowing whether the disappearance was permanent or temporary is its own specific, under-discussed form of prolonged uncertainty. She describes the 10 sessions of EMDR not just as Marcus's treatment, but as the slow, gradual return of a person she'd been living alongside, in a sense, without fully having it for years. Their relationship, she said since, didn't simply resume where it left off. It had to be rebuilt on somewhat different terms, informed by everything both of them had learned, involuntarily, about how a traumatized nervous system actually works. Part 4, The One Still Walking. Her name, for this story, is Renata. She is 42. The events that shaped her trajectory happened between the ages of 6 and 14, in a household this series will not describe in detail, because the details aren't what matters here. What matters is what happened afterwards, across nearly 3 decades, and what continues to happen now. Renata's trajectory is chronic, and this series is going to sit with that word honestly, rather than rushing past it toward a tidier ending, because chronic trajectories are real and well documented and make up a meaningful share of Banano's 4 categories, and a documentary that only ever tells resolved stories is quietly lying about what trauma recovery actually, statistically, looks like for a real portion of survivors. Renata meets criteria for what episode 6 calls complex PTSD, Judith Herman's framework, built specifically around trauma that is prolonged, repeated, and inescapable, exactly the shape of Renata's childhood. She has been in some form of treatment, with breaks, for 19 years. She has done EMDR twice, with different therapists, years apart. She spent 8 months in internal family systems work, the parts framework from episode 6, and describes it as the first therapy that made sense of a pattern she'd never had language for, a part of her that took over in any conflict and apologized reflexively, compulsively, for things that were never her fault, exactly like the fawn response described back in episode 2. None of it has produced what she'd call resolution. She still has periods not constant, but recurring, sometimes months apart, where the fog episode she described as a functional freeze returns, and she moves through days feeling, in her words, like she's watching her own life on a slight delay. She still, occasionally, loses a stretch of time the way episode 3 described dissociative amnesia, not years, the way that composite case study described, but hours, sometimes an entire afternoon, unaccounted for. This is not a story about a treatment that failed, and it would be a serious misreading of the evidence in this series to hear it that way. Every mechanism this series has documented the reduced non-response rates for gold standard treatments named honestly back in episode 1, the 25 to 35% dropout figures from episode 5, the sheer complexity of trauma that begins before a person's identity has even finished forming, which episode 6 spent an entire hour explaining. All of it converges on a simple, difficult truth. For a meaningful number of survivors, particularly those whose trauma was prolonged, early, and inflicted by someone who should have protected them instead, full resolution, in the tidy sense the word implies, may not be a realistic or even an appropriate goal. What Renata would tell you, if this were a real interview rather than a composite, is that her life today is meaningfully, measurably better than it was 10 years ago, and that, better, has stopped meaning symptom-free and started meaning something more like what episode 6 framework of reclaimed agency actually describes. She has a job she's held for 6 years, the longest of her adult life. She has a small number of relationships she trusts, genuinely, rather than performing trust the way the fawn pattern once required. She has, crucially, stopped treating the bad stretches as evidence that all the work has failed and started treating them as whether real, sometimes difficult, but no longer proof that the underlying ground has shifted back to where it started. Clinicians who work with chronic trajectory patients increasingly describe this reframe as itself a form of meaningful progress, distinct from symptoms. Elimination, a shift from measuring recovery by the absence of bad days to measuring it by a person's relationship to those days when they come. This isn't a consolation prize dressed up as success. It's a different, equally legitimate definition of what healing can mean for the portion of survivors for whom the version this series has otherwise described regulation, memory coherence, reclaimed agency, and arriving at a stable new baseline remains, honestly, a work permanently in progress rather than a chapter with a final page. Renata has developed, over the years, a specific, practical vocabulary with her employer, not a full disclosure of her history, which she has chosen not to share at work, but a simple, agreed-upon signal for the days the fog descends, allowing her to take a reduced-load day without needing to explain why. This kind of practical accommodation rarely appears in trauma narratives, which tend to focus on the therapy room rather than the Tuesday afternoon at a desk, but it represents exactly the kind of unglamorous, structural self-mastery episode 6 discussion of reclaimed agency was pointing toward, not eliminating the bad days, but building a life resilient enough to absorb them without everything else collapsing alongside. She describes the version of herself from 19 years ago as someone who would have quit that job at the first bad week, certain it was proof she was fundamentally unfit for it. The version of herself now recognizes the fog for what it is, waits it out, and returns to her desk the following week largely unchanged in anyone else's eyes. Part 5, the one who seemed fine, until she wasn't. Her name, for this story, is Priya. She is 51. 19 years ago, she was a first responder at a mass casualty event this series will not name specifically. For 17 years afterwards, by every available measure, she was fine. She worked. She raised 2 children. She did not have nightmares, did not flinch at sirens despite hearing them constantly in her line of work, did not, as far as she or anyone close to her could tell, carry any lasting mark from what she'd witnessed. Then, 2 years ago, her father died, an ordinary, expected loss, the kind of grief researchers would call unremarkable in its own right, and something in her broke open that had nothing, on the surface, to do with her father at all. The nightmares that started weren't about him. They were about the event 19 years earlier, arriving in vivid, specific, sensory detail, exactly as episode 3 described trauma memory surfacing, fragments first, then, over weeks, something closer to a coherent, unbearable narrative. Priya's trajectory is delayed onset, the least common of Bonanno's 4 categories and the one clinicians still understand least well. Current research offers partial explanations rather than a complete one. An unrelated later stressor, especially one involving loss, can sometimes destabilize a nervous system's long-standing coping structure enough that earlier, previously well-managed material becomes newly accessible and newly overwhelming. Some researchers describe this as the psychological equivalent of a structure that was never actually as stable as it looked, held together for years by resources, routine, distraction, an intact support system until a new, unrelated crisis happened to strain past their limit. This is one of the more counterintuitive findings in all of trauma research, and this episode includes it specifically because it complicates any simple story about a linear timeline from event to symptom to treatment to recovery. Priya did not fail to heal in the first 17 years. By every measure available at the time, she had genuinely, legitimately landed on something very close to Amara's resilient trajectory. The delayed trajectory suggests that even a genuinely resilient adaptation can, under specific later circumstances, give way not because it was fake, but because resilience, like every mechanism this series has described, is a dynamic process rather than a permanent, guaranteed state. Priya's treatment, beginning 2 years ago, moved faster than Marcus's had, in one specific sense. She arrived with none of the avoidance patterns that often build up over years of untreated symptoms, because for her, there hadn't been years of symptoms yet to build the avoidance around. 6 months of EMDR, combined with the kind of grief-focused work her father's death also required running alongside it, brought her to what she now describes as a new, different kind of stable, not a return to the 17 years of not thinking about it, which she now understands was never really processing so much as genuinely, legitimately not needing to yet, but something closer to what Marcus eventually reached. A coherent story, in the sense episode 3 described, that she can now hold, without it periodically ambushing her. Her adult children, both in their 20s by the time this began, describe a specific kind of disorientation of their own, watching a parent who had always represented steadiness itself go through something that looked, from the outside, like a sudden, uncharacteristic unraveling. One of them has since said that understanding the delayed trajectory, that this wasn't new damage but 19-year-old material finally finding a moment able to hold it, changed how the whole family related to what was happening. It stopped looking like their mother suddenly breaking and started looking like their mother, for the first time, having the space and the reason to finally process something she'd been quietly carrying, intact and unexamined, since before either of them was born. Part 6, the story the camera usually tells. Before moving to the clinician's perspective, this episode owes you one further piece of honesty, because it concerns documentaries themselves, including, potentially, this one. Media researchers who study how trauma recovery gets portrayed on screen have identified a consistent, distorting pattern. Recovery narratives in film and television overwhelmingly favor a specific shape: crisis, breakthrough, resolution, usually compressed into a satisfying arc of weeks or months, frequently anchored around a single dramatic turning point. This shape maps reasonably well onto part of Marcus's story, loosely onto part of Priya's, and almost not at all onto Renata's, whose 19 years of ongoing, non-linear effort resist compression into anything a 90-minute film would find satisfying to screen. This matters because the mismatch has real consequences for real survivors. Clinicians report that patients whose recovery doesn't follow the media's preferred shape, the ones on chronic trajectories, the ones whose progress looks like Renata's rather than a rising line, frequently arrive at therapy carrying an additional, unnecessary burden: the belief that their failure to recover properly, on the expected timeline, in the expected shape, is evidence of some personal failing, rather than an accurate reflection of one entirely normal, well-documented trajectory among 4. This series has tried, across 7 episodes, to resist exactly this distortion, including Renata's story in full, without softening it into something more screen-friendly, is a direct response to it. Whether we've fully succeeded is, honestly, for you to judge. But the attempt itself is deliberate, and it's the reason this episode spent as much time on the chronic and delayed trajectories as it did on the more conventionally satisfying recovery arc. Part 7, The View from the Other Chair. There's a perspective this episode hasn't yet included, and it belongs to the clinicians who sit across from people like Amara, Marcus, Renata, and Priya every week, usually without knowing, in the first session, which of the 4 trajectories are they looking at? A therapist with 2 decades of trauma-focused practice describes this not knowing as one of the genuinely difficult, rarely discussed aspects of the work. A new client walks in, and there is no reliable test, no questionnaire, no biological marker from episode 1's discussion of hippocampal volume or episode 2's heart rate variability research that can tell a clinician with confidence, in that first session, whether they are looking at someone who will need 6 sessions or 6 years, someone whose apparent resilience is genuine or fragile, someone whose current stability will hold. Or, like Priya's, prove to be resting on a foundation that hasn't yet been tested. Clinicians learn, of necessity, to hold this uncertainty alongside their patients rather than resolving it prematurely with false reassurance in either direction. This uncertainty cuts against a deep, natural human wish both the patients and, often, the clinicians own for a clear prognosis delivered early. Tell me how long this takes, tell me if I'll be one of the lucky ones. The honest answer, consistent with everything Bonanno's research has found, is usually some version of, we won't fully know until we're further into it, and even then, the road can still bend in ways neither of us predicted. Experienced clinicians describe learning to treat this not as a failure of their expertise, but as an accurate reflection of a genuinely complex, still incompletely understood biological and psychological process. The same complexity this series has spent 6 episodes trying to honor rather than oversimplify. What clinicians can offer, even without a reliable early prognosis, is exactly what this series has spent 7 episodes documenting: an accurate map of the mechanisms involved, a menu of treatments with real, if uneven, evidence behind them, and the steady, repeated presence that episode 2 identified as co-regulation itself, one of the few factors that shows up, again and again, across outcome research as making a measurable difference, regardless of which of the 4 trajectories a given patient eventually turns out to be walking. There's a specific skill experienced trauma clinicians describe developing over years of practice that rarely gets named directly, tolerating their own uncertainty in front of a suffering person, without either manufacturing false confidence to ease the moment or transmitting their own anxiety about the unknown outcome onto a patient who is already carrying more than enough. One clinician, reflecting on decades of practice, described the shift in her own approach over time. Early in her career, she felt pressure to offer reassuring timelines she genuinely couldn't back with evidence. Later, she learned to say, honestly, some version of what this entire series has tried to model: here is what the research tells us is possible, here is what we don't yet know, and here is what we can control regardless of which road this turns out to be. She describes this shift as having made her, somewhat counterintuitively, more reassuring to patients rather than less, because patients, she found, could generally tell the difference between confidence that was earned and confidence that was performed for their benefit, and tended to trust the former considerably more. Part 8, When the Trauma Belongs to Everyone. One more dimension belongs in this episode before its close, because every story so far has been individual, and not all trauma is. Entire communities after a natural disaster, a mass violence event, or a war sometimes move through these same 4 trajectories together, in ways that interact with, and sometimes reshape, the individual patterns this episode has focused on. Research on collective trauma has found that community-level factors, the strength of local social bonds, the presence of shared rituals for grief and remembrance, a community's collective narrative about what happened and what it means, can shift outcomes for individuals within that community in ways that echo, at a larger scale, exactly the mechanisms this series has documented. In single nervous systems, a neighborhood that collectively rebuilds a gathering space destroyed by disaster, that holds a shared annual remembrance, that develops, in McAdams' terms from episode 6, a communal redemption narrative rather than a communal contamination one, appears to shift the balance of individual trajectories within it, not eliminating chronic or delayed responses, but measurably increasing the proportion of community members who land on resilient or recovery paths, compared to communities where the aftermath is left to each individual to process in isolation. This matters for how this entire series should be understood in its broadest sense. Every mechanism named across 7 episodes, nervous system regulation, memory coherence, interoceptive reconnection, and reclaimed agency, has, so far, been described primarily as work happening inside one person, sometimes with the help of one clinician. The research on collective trauma suggests these same mechanisms scale upward, imperfectly but genuinely, to families, workplaces, and entire communities, and that the co-regulation episode 2 described between two people has a larger, slower-moving cousin operating at the level of a shared culture of remembrance and response. Consider a composite drawn from documented patterns in post-disaster community recovery. A small town, struck by a severe flood that destroyed roughly a third of its homes and claimed several lives. In the immediate aftermath, researchers studying comparable events have found that towns diverge, sometimes sharply, based on factors with little to do with the severity of the flood itself. Towns that organized rapid, visible collective responses, shared rebuilding efforts, town hall spaces for people to voice grief and anger together rather than separately, an annual remembrance that named what was lost without either wallowing in it or rushing past it, showed, in follow-up. Research years later showed lower rates of chronic PTSD meaningfully among residents compared to demographically similar towns where recovery was left to individual households, insurance claims, and private grief. The mechanism researchers point to is strikingly similar to the individual case studies earlier in this episode: a restored sense of agency, delivered collectively rather than individually. Residents who helped rebuild a neighbor's home reported better outcomes than residents who received equivalent material help passively, suggesting that the active, chosen nature of the contribution mattered as much as the material result. This has direct, practical implications for how communities might respond to future collective trauma, and it echoes something this entire series has insisted on from its very first episode: passive receipt of help, while sometimes necessary, tends to produce weaker outcomes than active agency. Restoring participation in one's own recovery, whether that recovery is happening in a single nervous system or an entire town. Part 9, What determines the road? For stories, for trajectories, and the question this raises, inevitably, is whether anything reliably predicts which road a given person ends up on. The honest research answer, per Bananos. His own later work on what he specifically termed the resilience paradox is less than researchers would like and less than any tidy documentary conclusion would prefer to tell you. Some factors do correlate, modestly, with better outcomes across the research literature this series has drawn from across 7 episodes: the strength and speed of social support, named in episode 2's discussion of co-regulation. The absence of significant prior trauma is narrowing the window of tolerance from episode 1. Access to appropriate treatment without the barriers, episode 5 spent an entire hour documenting. A capacity for meaning-making, whether through McAdams' narrative identity work from episode 6 or through the survivor mission Herman described in the same episode. But Bananos' research is explicit that these factors, even added together, explain only a modest portion of the variance in outcomes, meaning two people with apparently similar risk profiles, similar support systems, and similar treatment access can still end up on visibly different trajectories for reasons the current science cannot yet fully specify. Genetic research adds a further, humbling layer to this picture. Studies examining large cohorts for genetic markers associated with each of the 4 trajectories have found real, if modest, heritable contributions to resilient outcomes. Specifically, roughly 2/3 of participants in some studies showed the resilient pattern regardless of genetic profile, but certain genetic clusters appeared to shift the odds meaningfully within that majority. This doesn't mean trajectory is fixed at birth. Every treatment and mechanism this series has documented demonstrates real, measurable malleability regardless of a person's starting biology. It does mean that some portion of those who land where they are is, honestly, a matter of biological chance rather than effort, choice, or moral character, a point worth holding on to firmly, because the alternative belief, that trajectory is purely a matter of trying hard enough, quietly punishes exactly the survivors, like Renata, who have tried the hardest and longest with the least complete resolution to show for it. This should be received as something closer to humility than to fatalism. It means resilience is not a moral achievement, and chronic difficulty is not a moral failure, a point this series has made in nearly every episode, in nearly every context, because it bears endless repeating. It also means the specific trajectory any person will follow cannot be reliably predicted or guaranteed in advance, which is precisely why every treatment named across this series matters regardless of which of the four roads a given person turns out to be on. Even within the chronic trajectory, treatment measurably improves quality of life, even without producing the full resolution the word recovery implies. Even within the resilient trajectory, understanding the biology this series has documented can help a person recognize why they're doing better than they expected, rather than waiting anxiously for a collapse that, for a majority of people, statistically, simply never arrives. Part 10, 1 year later, for check-ins. Before this episode closes, a brief return to each of the four composites, roughly a year past where their stories left off, because trauma recovery research increasingly emphasizes that a snapshot, even an honest one, tells an incomplete story. Trajectories continue to unfold long after any documentary would naturally stop filming. Amara, checked in with a year later, remains on her original resilient trajectory, though she describes something worth naming, a brief, 3-week period roughly 2 years after the fire, coinciding with an unrelated stressful job transition, where she noticed mild sleep disruption she hadn't experienced since the fire itself. It resolved on its own, without treatment, and she now describes it not as a delayed trajectory beginning, in Priya's sense, but as ordinary evidence that resilience doesn't mean invulnerability to any future stress ever again, simply a nervous system with a wide enough window, in episode 2's terms, to absorb an occasional bad stretch without it becoming something larger. Marcus, a year past his 10th EMDR session, has added a specific new practice to his routine, monthly check-ins with his original clinician, not because he's in active crisis, but as what researchers increasingly call maintenance work, the recognition that regulation, once achieved, benefits from periodic reinforcement rather than being treated as a permanently completed task. He describes this not as a failure to be fully finished, but as roughly analogous to physical therapy after a serious injury. The acute work ends, but some ongoing attention keeps the gains from quietly eroding. Renata, a year further into her 19-year and counting journey, reports roughly the same frequency of difficult stretches as the year before, a detail worth including precisely because it complicates any narrative arc that would prefer to show her trending steadily upward. What has changed, she says, is entirely about her relationship to those stretches, not their frequency, less fear each time one begins, because 19 years of data now tell her, reliably, that it will also end. Priya, roughly 18 months past the start of her treatment, describes something neither pure resolution nor ongoing struggle, a settled, integrated relationship with a memory that spent 17 years sealed away and 2 years demanding urgent attention, now occupying what she calls its right-sized place, present, acknowledged, no longer either buried or dominant. Episode 8, Self-Mastery. Go back, one last time, to the hand on the kitchen counter. A door slams. A shoulder drops. A jaw locks. 7 episodes ago, this series opened with that image and a question: if a threat is over, why does the body sometimes refuse to believe it? We promised, at the time, that we weren't going to give you an easy answer. We haven't. What we've given you instead, across 7 episodes and what is likely close to 5 hours of evidence, controversy, biology, and real human stories, is something more useful than an easy answer, an honest, detailed map of what actually happens between the moment a threat ends and the moment a nervous system finally, fully believes it. This final episode is not a highlight reel. It's a synthesis and attempt to take every mechanism, every controversy, every therapy, and every honest uncertainty this series has named and show you how they actually fit together inside one working nervous system, inside one working life. And then, because a series that spent this much time being honest about difficulty owes you an equally honest closing statement, we're going to tell you, as plainly as the evidence allows, what self-mastery actually is, what it isn't, and what's genuinely possible on the other side of trauma. Part 1, the question we've been chasing. Let's name it directly, because it's been implicit in every episode and explicit in almost none of them. This series has been chasing the difference between control and mastery. Control, as we said back in episode 1, is a nervous system fighting itself, gritting through. White-knuckling calm doesn't feel like spending enormous energy holding a lid on a pot that never stops boiling underneath. Every symptom this series has documented is, in some sense, a story. About control failing, or control succeeding at a terrible cost. The flinch that arrives before conscious thought. The hypervigilance that never fully stands down. The fragmented memory that ambushes the present without warning. The body that amplifies pain because it never learned to trust its own signals. The self, in the most severe cases, fractured into pieces because staying whole was never survivable to begin with. Mastery is different, and it took 7 episodes of evidence to earn the right to define it properly. Mastery is not the absence of a threat response. This series has said, repeatedly, that fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are permanent, useful features of a functioning nervous system, not defects to be engineered away. Mastery is a nervous system that has been given enough real, repeated, felt evidence that a specific danger has passed, so that it can tell the difference between then and now. Reliably, most of the time, without a person having to force it through sheer will. That distinction, forced calm versus earned calm, is the entire spine of this series, and it's worth restating before we walk through how each of the previous 7 episodes built toward it. Part 2, The Body, Reconsidered from the Top. Episode 1 gave us the architecture, the amygdala as the alarm, the hippocampus as the filing cabinet, and the prefrontal cortex as the reasoning voice that goes quiet exactly when it's needed most. It also gave us this series' first and most important commitment to honesty, even when honesty complicated a compelling narrative. We told you, in that very first episode, that the popular idea the entire series takes its name from is scientifically contested, that serious researchers dispute specific claims about how completely trauma gets stored in the body, even as the underlying neuroscience of amygdala hyperreactivity and hippocampal changes remain well replicated. We told you 70% of people experience a potentially traumatic event, and that roughly 2/3 of them never develop lasting psychological injury, a fact that Bonanno's resilience research, 4 episodes later, would return to and expand into an entire framework of its own. We gave you the HPA axis and its strange, counterintuitive paradox, a stress response system that runs hot immediately after trauma and can, over years, run cold, producing the flat, exhausted effect so often mistaken for indifference rather than what it actually is, a system that spent itself out long ago. We gave you the history nobody teaches, shell shock, stripped from the diagnostic manual in 1968, fought back into it by Vietnam veterans who refused to accept that their suffering had no name. Episode 2 took us inside the nervous system's actual machinery, fight, flight, freeze, and the more recently named fawn response, and into another live scientific dispute, this one around polyvagal theory is contested by 39 researchers in a paper published the same year this series was written. We gave you the window of tolerance, Daniel Siegel's less contested, more clinically durable framework, and we gave you Walter Cannon, standing at the actual historical origin of the phrase, fight or flight, a full century before this series existed, to explain what he'd found. We gave you the uncomfortable, important overlap between childhood hypervigilance and ADHD misdiagnosis, attention, working exactly as designed, pointed at the wrong target by an environment that demanded constant vigilance. We gave you co-regulation, the finding that nervous systems settle with each other, a thread that would resurface in every subsequent episode, from Marcus's marriage in episode 7 to the community-level disaster recovery research in that same episode's later section. Episode 3 took the hardest turn of the entire series, into the memory wars, the century-old, still unresolved argument about whether trauma can be repressed and later recovered, running all the way back to Freud's own reversal on his seduction theory and Pierre Janet's competing, largely eclipsed framework of dissociated, fixed ideas. We told you, honestly, that this argument has real victims on every side of it, survivors disbelieved and people wrongly convicted based on memories that may have formed through suggestion rather than experience. We gave you the distinction between explicit and implicit memory and the architecture underneath why trauma so often arrives as a fragment rather than a story. We gave you the sobering research on flashbulb memory's vividness that feels like proof and isn't. We gave you no resolution to the central argument. Because there isn't one yet, and pretending otherwise would have been a betrayal of everything this series claims to stand for. Episode 4 moved into the body directly, chronic pain, interoception, the gut-brain axis anchored by a cautionary tale about ulcerative colitis, wrongly called psychosomatic for decades. Before medicine understood it as a real autoimmune disease. We used that history deliberately, as a check against every claim in the rest of the episode, including the excellent evidence behind pain Reprocessing therapy, because a mind-body connection that's real must never become an excuse to stop looking for a physical cause a doctor simply hasn't found yet. We gave you the specific, documented gender bias in how pain gets believed, endometriosis' 7 to 10 year average diagnostic delay standing as a direct, damning illustration of exactly the dismissal this episode warned against perpetuating. We gave you long COVID as a live, current test case of the very same argument playing out in real time, in real clinics, as this series was being written. Episode 5 pulled together the entire treatment landscape and walked directly into the frontier. Including MDMA-assisted therapy, a treatment this series had to tell you plainly did not receive FDA approval, despite genuinely strong trial data, because the honest story of science includes the stories that don't work out the way their advocates hoped. We gave you ketamine-assisted psychotherapy's real promise alongside its real, documented equity barriers, the firefighter paying for cabs and ferries just to reach a clinic, a detail this series included specifically because promising science does very little for the person who cannot get in the door. We gave you the honest reminder that access, not discovery, remains trauma treatment's single largest unsolved problem. Episode 6 took us into identity itself, Judith Herman's complex PTSD framework, still unrecognized by the American Diagnostic Manual decades after she proposed it. Internal family systems therapy is still earlier in its evidence base than the CBT and EMDR this series covered in earlier episodes, and narrative identity theory, complete with the honest caveat that its central finding may be a culturally American story shape rather than a universal psychological law. We gave you this series' clearest articulation yet of what reclaimed agency actually feels like from the inside, not a triumphant declaration, but an ordinary moment, passing without incident, that a nervous system quietly files away as new evidence. And episode 7 gave us Bonanno's 4 trajectories: resilient, recovery, chronic, and delayed, and 4 composite stories built to resist the flattening this series named directly as one of documentary television's most common failures, the temptation to compress every recovery into the same satisfying shape, regardless of whether that shape fits the actual, uneven, sometimes unresolved evidence in front of you. We gave you Renata, walking a road that may never fully end, specifically because a series willing to sit with genuine scientific controversy owed you the same willingness to sit with a genuinely unresolved human story, rather than trading it for a more comfortable ending. 7 episodes. 7 distinct bodies of evidence. One through line, now visible in full. Every mechanism this series has documented is, underneath its specific biology, doing the same essential work, closing the gap between what a nervous system believes and what is actually, currently true. Part 3, One Life, Every Mechanism. To make this synthesis concrete rather than abstract, this episode is going to do something the previous 7 haven't, follow a single composite life, from the original injury through every mechanism this series has named, showing how they actually operate together rather than as isolated topics in isolated episodes. Her name, for this final story, is Dana. She is 39. The event that shaped her trajectory happened when she was 17. A car accident that killed a close friend and left Dana, in the passenger seat, physically unharmed and, for the next 22 years, quietly convinced that her survival had been some kind of accounting error the universe would eventually correct. In the language of episode 1, Dana's amygdala learned, in the seconds surrounding that accident, to treat a specific category of stimulus, sudden motion in her peripheral vision, the particular pitch of a car horn, as maximum threat, and her prefrontal cortex, for years afterwards, went reliably offline whenever either occurred. Her hippocampus, in that same episode's language, appears to have struggled to file the event with the ordinary, then, not now, stamp a pattern consistent with the smaller hippocampal volumes episode 1 described in some trauma survivors, though this series has never had, and will not pretend to have, an actual scan of Dana's brain to confirm it. In the language of episode 2, she lived predominantly in a chronic, low-grade fight state for 2 decades, a short temper she attributed to personality rather than physiology, and a driving style so defensive that her friends had stopped accepting rides from her by her late 20s. She would later describe, in treatment, a specific and telling detail she had never, in 22 years, allowed anyone else to drive when she was in the car, a detail her therapist immediately recognized as chronic hypervigilance wearing the disguise of a harmless personal preference, exactly the kind of disguise. Episode 2 spent an entire hour teaching this audience to recognize it. In the language of episode 3, her memory of the accident itself was genuinely fragmented. She could recall the sound with total, visceral clarity, the specific pitch of it, something she said she could still reproduce, note for note, at 39, and could not, for years, reconstruct the 20 minutes immediately afterwards in any coherent order. She had pieces, a stranger's jacket around her shoulders, the specific shade of the ambulance's interior light, and a paramedic's voice asking her a question she could never remember answering. What she didn't have, for nearly 2 decades, was any sense of how those pieces connected, or in what order they'd actually occurred precisely. The fragmentation. Episode 3 spent an hour explaining, sensory detail intact, narrative thread missing. In the language of episode 4, she developed, by her early 30s, chronic tension headaches her doctors could never fully explain, alongside a documented pattern. Precisely the interoceptive disconnect episode 4 described, of routinely failing to notice her own hunger, fatigue, or rising anxiety until each had become acute. She recalls, vividly, a doctor in her late 20s, suggesting the headaches were probably stress, delivered in a tone she experienced, fairly or not, as dismissive. Exactly the kind of encounter episode 4 spent its opening minutes warning against, regardless of whether the doctor's underlying instinct about stress turned out to have some genuine basis. She began treatment at 35, 4 years before this composite check-in, prompted not by a crisis but by something smaller, a new relationship serious enough that her partner, gently, asked why she flinched at car horns on television. That single, ordinary question, she later said, did more to start her treatment than anything a clinician ever asked her. Her path, mapped against episode 5's honest accounting of access and sequencing, began with 8 months of trauma-sensitive yoga. The interoceptive reconnection work from episode 1 and 4, both taken slowly, at a studio she could actually reach, chosen specifically over a more specialized clinic 40 minutes further away, because episode 5's central insistence, that the right treatment is the one you can actually get to, turned out, for Dana, to be more than an abstraction. She described the first several months as frustrating in a specific way. Nothing dramatic happened, no breakthrough, just weeks of learning to notice, without panic, what her own body was actually doing in a given moment. Her instructor, unprompted, once pointed out that Dana had spent an entire 20-minute session with her jaw visibly clenched and no apparent awareness of it at all, a small, unremarkable observation that Dana has since described as one of the more genuinely startling moments of her adult life. It moved, after that foundation, into EMDR 12 sessions, not the 10 this series cited for Marcus in episode 7, because Dana's memory fragmentation, exactly as episode 3 would predict, required additional sessions specifically focused on sequencing the disordered timeline of those 20 minutes after the crash into something coherent, closer to narrative exposure. The therapy approach from episode 3 differs from EMDR's usual protocol. Session 6, she has said, was the hardest, not the crash itself, which she'd expected to be the difficult part, but the stranger's jacket, which turned out to be carrying an entire freight of unprocessed grief about her friend that the jacket detail had apparently been holding in trust for 22 years, waiting for a moment safe enough to release it. Somewhere around session 9, in language straight out of episode 6, Dana identified what she came to call, only half-jokingly, her designated driver, a protector part, in internal family systems terms, that had been running her actual driving, her career choices, and a fair portion of her relationships for 22 years, always steering toward the safest, most controlled, least spontaneous option available. She describes a specific exercise with her therapist imagining the designated driver as a distinct, almost visible presence, thanking it directly for 2 decades of vigilant, exhausting work, and only then, from that position of gratitude rather than frustration, beginning to negotiate a smaller, less totalizing role for it going forward. Naming it, she said, didn't make it disappear. It gave her, for the first time, the half-second of space. Episode 6 described just enough room, on a good day, to notice the designated driver taking the wheel and gently ask whether this particular decision actually required it. 4 years into treatment, Dana's trajectory, in Bonanno's framework from episode 7, looks like recovery, real, substantial early symptoms, followed by real, substantial, durable improvement, arrived at through exactly the rough staircase, not a smooth line that every honest case study in this series has described. She still doesn't love car horns. She can now drive her partner's elderly mother to appointments without needing 40 minutes afterwards to recover, which 4 years ago would have been unthinkable. She let her partner drive for the first time 18 months into treatment. A specific, dated, remembered evening she still refers to by name, the night I let go of the wheel, which functions, in her own private narrative, exactly as McAdams' framework from episode 6 would predict, a turning point scene in a story she now actively, consciously narrates as one of recovery rather than one of ongoing damage. Her chronic headaches, per her most recent checkup, have become infrequent enough that her doctor has stopped monitoring them as an ongoing concern. This is what self-mastery actually looks like assembled in full, across a single working life, not one dramatic mechanism, but nearly a dozen of them, from 4 different episodes of this series. Operating in sequence and in concert, over years, imperfectly, toward a baseline that is real, stable, and still, honestly, not entirely symptom-free. Part 4, A Second Life, A Different Shape. Dana's story, however thoroughly it draws on this series' full range of mechanisms, still represents one particular trajectory: Banano's recovery category, arriving eventually at a stable, substantially improved baseline. Because Episode 7 insisted so firmly on the danger of flattening every recovery into the same shape, this finale owes you a second composite, briefer but equally grounded in this series' evidence, illustrating a different shape entirely. His name, for this second story, is Tomas. He is 26. His trauma is recent, 18 months old, not 22 years, a serious workplace injury that left him with chronic pain in his lower back, precisely the territory Episode 4 spent an hour explaining, real tissue damage that has since largely healed, according to every scan his doctors have run, alongside pain that has, if anything, intensified rather than faded as the visible injury resolved. Tomas's story is not primarily about memory fragmentation or a fractured sense of self. It's a comparatively pure illustration of Episode 4's central argument, isolated and magnified, a nervous system that learned, through a single acute injury, to treat an entire category of movement, bending, lifting, certain rotations of his lower back, as maximum threat, producing genuine, severe pain through the nosoplastic amplification process that Episode explained in detail, even though the original tissue damage has, by every objective measure, healed. His path into treatment took considerably longer than Dana's, for a specific, well-documented reason Episode 4 spent its opening minutes warning against. His first 4 physicians, working entirely within a structural, tissue-focused model, could find no adequate explanation for pain this severe given how little damage remained visible on imaging, and at least one, echoing almost exactly the dismissive language Episode 4's opening case study described, suggested the pain might be mostly in his head, a phrase Tomas has said did more damage to his willingness to seek further help than the original injury itself. It was his 5th physician who introduced him to pain reprocessing therapy, the treatment this series identified back in Episode 4 as producing some of the strongest single results in its entire evidence base. 66% of patients were pain-free or nearly so in the rigorous trial this series cited, with matching brain imaging evidence that the change was real rather than merely reported. For Tomas, the critical shift wasn't a new physical technique. It was a specific, evidence-backed reframe, that his nervous system, not his tissue, had become the primary source of his ongoing pain, and that this made the pain neither fake nor a psychological failing but a genuine, treatable, biological amplification loop, exactly as Episode 4 described. 6 months into treatment, Tomas is not pain-free. He is, by his own account, roughly 70% improved, able to return to a modified version of his previous job, able to lift his young nephew without the anticipatory bracing that once accompanied nearly every physical movement he made. His trajectory, mapped against Banano's framework, remains genuinely ambiguous at this early stage, trending toward recovery, but recent enough that this series, committed to the same honesty it has held throughout, will not claim to know yet where it definitively lands. We include Tomas specifically because his story, unlike Dana's sprawling, decade-spanning integration of nearly every mechanism this series has covered, illustrates something different and equally important, that self-mastery doesn't always require years of multimodal work touching every system this series has described. Sometimes, as Episode 4 insisted, it requires one specific, well-evidenced reframe, delivered by the right clinician after 4 who got it wrong, and enough. It's time for a nervous system to learn, through a targeted intervention, that the amplification loop it built to protect a healing injury is no longer serving the purpose it once did. Part 5, Before the Flinch, What Can Be Built in Advance. Every mechanism this series has documented so far describes repair after the fact, a nervous system, already dysregulated, being brought back towards safety through months or years of careful work. There's a related, newer body of research this finale should include, because it asks a different, in some ways more hopeful question: can any of this be built in advance, before trauma occurs as a kind of protective inoculation rather than only a later repair? The evidence here connects directly back to Bonanno's resilience research from episode 7. Because resilience, not chronic dysfunction, turns out to be the majority outcome after trauma, researchers have become increasingly interested in what separates people already positioned for a resilient trajectory before anything happens to them at all. Existing social connection, named. Throughout this series, co-regulation appears to function partly as this kind of advanced protection, not something to be built only in a crisis, but a form of psychological infrastructure worth maintaining as a matter of course, the way physical exercise protects a body against injuries that haven't happened yet. The window of tolerance from episode 2, similarly, is not fixed at some baseline width the person is simply handed at birth. Practices like the heart rate variability biofeedback covered in that same episode, or a regular embodiment practice like the trauma-sensitive yoga named across nearly every episode of this series, appear to genuinely widen that window over time, in people who have not experienced significant trauma at all, in the same way they help repair it in people who have. This has specific, practical implications worth naming directly, translated out of research language into something closer to genuine guidance. Regular physical movement that includes the interoceptive component, not simply exercise for cardiovascular benefit, but movement practiced with real attention to internal sensation. The specific skill episode 4 identified as commonly disrupted after trauma appears to build exactly the kind of body awareness infrastructure that made the difference, in composite form, between Tomas's early physicians missing his condition entirely and his fifth physician recognizing it accurately. Maintaining, rather than waiting to rebuild, a small number of genuinely trusted relationships functions as exactly the kind of standing co-regulation resource episode 2 identified as protective and available immediately, rather than needing to be located and built from scratch in the middle of a crisis. And a general practice of narrative reflection, not formal therapy, simply the ordinary human habit of making sense of difficult experiences through talking or writing about them, in something like the redemption sequence pattern. McAdams' research described in episode 6 appears to build narrative flexibility in advance, the same skill Renata, in episode 7, had to build slowly and painfully, in the middle of active crisis, without having had the chance to build it beforehand. None of this constitutes trauma-proofing, and this series will not pretend otherwise. Priya's story from episode 7 stands as a direct rebuttal to any claim that sufficient preparation guarantees a resilient outcome. Her 17 years of apparent stability were real and still gave way. But the evidence does suggest something worth taking seriously, that the biological and psychological infrastructure this series has spent 7 episodes describing as repair work is not exclusively repair work. Built and maintained before the crisis arrives, it appears to shift the underlying odds modestly, the same modest effect sizes as Bonanno's resilience paradox research was described in episode 7, but genuinely toward the resilient and recovery trajectories and away from the chronic and delayed ones. This matters for how this finale wants to leave you, specifically because it reframes several mechanisms this series has spent 7 episodes describing only as treatment into something closer to ongoing maintenance relevant to every viewer, not only the portion of this audience who have already lived through what this series calls trauma. Episode 1: 70% lifetime exposure. Statistically, for most people watching this finale, the question is not whether a potentially traumatic event will happen, but when and what kind of nervous system will be standing there to meet it when it does. Part 6: What changed, and what didn't. Before turning to the frontier, this finale owes you one more piece of context, the wider cultural shift this series exists inside of and what that shift has and hasn't actually accomplished. In the 12 years since the book that gave this series its name and its central, contested framework was first published, the phrase, trauma-informed, has moved from a specialized clinical term into ordinary vocabulary used in schools, workplaces, criminal justice reform efforts, and casual conversation. Often, this series would note honestly, without the careful hedging and honest uncertainty this series has tried to model throughout. Trauma-sensitive yoga, barely present outside specialized clinics a decade ago, is now offered at general-purpose studios in most major cities. Terms like fight or flight, window of tolerance, and nervous system regulation, each covered in detail across this series' first 2 episodes, have become common enough in everyday conversation that a person can now reasonably expect a friend, rather than only a therapist, to recognize what they mean. This cultural shift carries real, documented benefits, reduced stigma, increased help-seeking, and a public vocabulary for experiences that previously had none, echoing exactly the fight Vietnam veterans waged in the 1970s that episode 1 described in detail. It also carries real, documented Costs, which this series committed to honesty, should not be left unexamined. Clinical terms are popularized faster than the public understanding of their actual, careful, contested scientific basis can keep up with. Sometimes get used more loosely than the evidence supports a friend diagnosing another friend's ordinary bad mood as dysregulation, or a workplace conflict reflexively labeled trauma response, without the careful, evidence-based framework this series spent 8 episodes trying to provide. Part 7, The Frontier, One Final Look. Before this series closes, it owes you an updated look at where the treatment frontier stands. Because science kept moving while these 8 episodes were being made, and a series, this commitment to honesty should update you rather than let its own earlier snapshots calcify into the final word. A newer intervention has entered clinical use since this series began covering trauma treatment in depth, the stellate ganglion block, a procedure borrowed from pain medicine, involving an ultrasound-guided anesthetic injection targeting a cluster of nerves in the neck that forms part of the sympathetic nervous system. The same accelerator system. Episode 2 spent an entire hour explaining. The procedure takes minutes. Across the published literature, between 70 and 83% of patients receiving it show clinically significant improvement in PTSD symptoms, with some studies finding it measurably reduces anxiety by roughly half. It represents something genuinely new in this series' treatment landscape, a direct, physical, minutes-long intervention on the nervous system itself, rather than the weeks or months of talk-based or movement-based work every other therapy in this series has required. Clinically, the underlying procedure has been used in pain medicine for nearly a century. Its specific application to psychiatric conditions is new territory, and like every frontier treatment this series has named, it comes with the same honest caveat: longer-term, larger-scale trials are still accumulating, and it is not currently positioned as a replacement for the trauma processing work of therapies like EMDR, but as a potential complement that may make that harder work more tolerable for patients whose baseline hyperarousal has made it previously inaccessible. There's also a new pharmacological candidate worth naming, a compound called TSND-201, which received breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA after phase 2 trial data showed rapid, durable symptom reduction for PTSD, working through a different mechanism than the psychedelic-adjacent compounds this series discussed in episode 5, targeting monoamine transporters without the same intense perceptual effects associated with MDMA. Unlike MDMA, it does not appear to require the same intensive, multi-hour guided psychotherapy sessions, potentially addressing some of the access barriers episode 5 spent an entire hour documenting. Though consistent with this series standard for every emerging treatment, it remains in trials, not yet available outside a research setting, and its own path to approval, given what happened to MDMA in 2024, is not guaranteed regardless of how promising its early data looks. Beyond these 2 specific developments, the broader direction of the field, as of this series' writing, points towards something episode 5 briefly named and this finale can now expand on: precision psychiatry, an effort to move trauma treatment away from a uniform, one-size-fits-all approach. Sequence and toward biomarker-informed matching using measurable signals like the heart rate variability research from episode 2, or emerging neuroimaging markers, to predict, before months of trial and error, which treatment a specific nervous system is most likely to respond to. This remains genuinely early science. But it represents a meaningful shift in ambition, from a field that has spent decades establishing that these treatments work, in general, across large groups toward a field beginning to ask the more specific, more useful question this series has implicitly asked in every composite case study: not, does EMDR work, but, does EMDR work for this particular nervous system, with this particular history, right now? And there's a piece of honesty this final episode owes you about even the most successful, most established treatments in this series. Outcome research increasingly shows that different symptom clusters respond unevenly to the same treatment. A study following veterans through residential PTSD treatment found that intrusive symptoms, flashbacks, specifically, were the least likely cluster to fully remit, even when overall treatment was judged successful, and were sometimes found more severe at follow-up than other, better resolved symptoms. This matters because it complicates any simple story about a treatment working or not working. For many patients, treatment succeeds substantially and unevenly at the same time, exactly the pattern Marcus's fireworks avoidance and Dana's residual startle response both illustrate in miniature. A 12-month follow-up of one intensive combined program, prolonged exposure, EMDR, and physical activity together, delivered over just 8 days, found this exact pattern: durable, substantial symptom reduction sustained a full year later, with over 90% of the original participants Still engaged in follow-up assessment, alongside real, honestly reported symptoms that persisted for a meaningful share of patients even after successful treatment by every standard clinical measure. Roughly half achieved what researchers termed full recovery on standard measures. A similar proportion no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD at all. Both of those numbers represent real, substantial success. Neither of them is universal. We include this not to undercut 7 episodes of genuinely hopeful evidence, but because a series this committed to honesty about van der Kolk's contested claims, about polyvagal theory's live scientific dispute, about the memory war's unresolved tension, and about MDMA's regulatory rejection owes you the same honesty about its own most recommended treatments. They work, substantially, for a great many people, and they do not work completely for anyone in the sense of erasing what happened. That is not a failure of the field. It is the accurate shape of what healing from something this serious actually, realistically looks like. Part 8, What We Got Wrong, or at least incomplete. A series built around scientific honesty owes its audience one more thing before closing, an accounting of its own limitations. This series drew heavily on composite case studies rather than named, verifiable individuals, a deliberate choice, protecting privacy while illustrating well-documented clinical patterns, but a choice that means every human story in these 8 episodes represents a pattern rather than a verified individual case and should be understood that way. This series covered controversies as they stood as of the summer of 2026: the polyvagal theory dispute, the ulcerative colitis history, and MDMA's regulatory status, and some of these, particularly the live, unresolved scientific arguments, may have moved by the time you're watching this. This series focused overwhelmingly on trauma treatment as practiced and researched in the United States and, to a lesser extent, Western Europe. The treatment access barriers named in Episode 5, the specific regulatory bodies named throughout, and even the demographic composition of the research this series cited skew heavily toward wealthy, Western, English-language clinical and academic contexts, and this series did not have the space to adequately address how trauma, its expression, and its treatment vary across the vastly different cultural and economic contexts most of the world's trauma survivors actually live in. There are further gaps worth naming specifically. This series discussed collective and community trauma only once, briefly, in Episode 7, when the subject arguably deserved its own dedicated hour: war, genocide, forced displacement, and intergenerational trauma passed down through communities rather than single nervous systems represent some of the most significant trauma burdens on the planet, and this series' individual nervous system framework, useful as it has been, was never fully built to capture harm that operates at that scale. This series also said relatively little about trauma in children currently experiencing it, as opposed to adults processing childhood trauma. Trauma retrospectively is a related but distinct field, with its own specialized research base, that would merit a series of its own. And this series, built around a narration-driven format without featured named experts, by design left out the specific, textured expertise that only a real, named clinician or researcher, speaking in their own voice, can provide: a deliberate structural choice for this format, but one worth naming as a real limitation rather than a neutral stylistic preference. We name these limitations not as a disclaimer to be skipped past, but because the same standard. This series held every scientific claim to precision over impressiveness and honest uncertainty over false confidence. It should apply to the series itself.